Just to let everybody know, this meeting is being recorded. This is the June P&T Committee / DUR Board for the Oregon Health Authority Fee-for-Service Medicaid Program. Welcome. Some general announcements on the screen. Been mentioned, if you're able, for those in the audience, we'd appreciate you putting your full name and your affiliation so that we can capture that for the minutes to record that correctly. With that, we're going to start with roll call and introductions. So on the screen, you'll see the committee members with their position they fill and their expiration date. We'll just start from the top and work our way down. Tim?
Yeah, I'm Tim Langford. I'm the pharmacy director with Klamath Tribal Health. I'm happy to be serving here.
Welcome, Tim. Karen?
Hello, I'm Karen Michelson. I'm the pharmacy director for the Coquille Indian Tribe in Coos Bay.
Welcome, Karen. Robin?
Hi, I'm Robin Moody. I'm executive director of soon to be All Smiles Community Oral Health. Will be renamed to that title tomorrow. I'm a P&T member.
Congratulations. Welcome. Bill?
I've had a title change. I've retired from the residency faculty, but I'm currently a physician advisor to the hospital program for Samaritan Corvallis. I'm a family physician.
Welcome and congratulations as you change your position.
Fade out.
Doug?
I'm Douglas Carr. I'm medical director at Umpqua Health and board certified internist.
Great. Welcome, Doug. Russ?
Hey, I'm Russ Huffman. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner with Salem Health.
Welcome. Ariko?
Hi, I'm Eriko Nishi, family medicine at OHSU.
Welcome. And Eddie?
Hi, Eddie Saito, Associate Professor of School of Pharmacy at Pacific University and clinical pharmacist with Virginia Garcia.
Welcome. Thanks, Eddie. Pat and Kat are not able to join us, so Stacy, we'll let you take it home.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stacy Ramirez. I'm faculty at OSU College of Pharmacy, and then a clinical pharmacist and director of pharmacy for the community health centers of Benton and Lynn counties.
And Stacy is the chair of the P&T committee this year. Next, we'll go to staff.
Jennifer Bowen, Executive Support, Oregon Health Authority.
Roger Citron, Director of the Drug Use Research and Management Program.
Trevor Douglas, OHA Pharmacy Director.
Dave Engen, Clinical Pharmacist with the OSU Derm Group.
Sarah Fletcher, P&T Clinical Coordinator with OSU Derm.
This is Andrew Gibler, Clinical Pharmacy Manager with OHA.
Kyle Hamilton. I'm the Pharmacy Drug Coordinator with the Oregon Health Authority.
Megan isn't able to join us today, so Deanna, we'll turn it over to you.
I'm Deanna Moretz, Clinical Pharmacist with the OSU College of Pharmacy Derm Group.
Amanda is also not able to join. It's Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Centena, and I'm also a clinical pharmacist with the OSU Derm Group.
And hi, I'm Sarah Servet. I'm a pharmacist and P&T clinical coordinator with the Derm Group.
Hi, I'm Lance Starkweather. I'm the pharmacy manager for Gainwell Technologies.
And I did not see Dee join. Brandon?
Good afternoon. My name is Brandon Wells. I'm the pharmacy program analyst in fee-for-service at OHA.
And we also won't have Ted join us today. For the audience, point your direction to our website where the information to join this meeting and the meeting materials are posted. You can follow along in the packet. So we are moving on for a conflict of interest declaration. Very important to the OHA, all staff and all committee members have up-to-date conflict of interest declarations on file with the OHA. Similarly, anybody wishing to provide public comment today has filled out a one-page conflict of interest declaration. But we do invite the committee members, if they have any new conflicts that they haven't been able to update the OHA about, to take the opportunity now to disclose those. or recuse yourself if we get to a topic that you feel you need to. But with that, we'll move on to the approval of the agenda and the minutes. If you're following along in the packet, you can find those on page 4. So I brought this to the attention of the committee in advance. So you had an opportunity to review. Are there any edits that need to be considered? And if not, we need a motion to approve.
Motion to approve the minutes.
Great, thank you, Doug.
Second.
All right, I
All
got
those in
6.
favor? Oop, sorry. All
Go
those
for
in
it,
favor?
Stacy.
Aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Abstain? Thank you.
We're going to turn it over to Andrew for the department update.
I don't think we have anything to share in terms of updates, but open it up if there's any questions. Do want to again thank you for your effort and your time that you commit to the OHA and OHP to help with this committee, and we really, really appreciate that. Is there anything anyone else from OHA would like to bring up? Okay.
Great, thank you, Andrew.
Proceed, yeah.
Next, we have the legislative update. Again, I haven't seen Dee be able to join. Trevor, would you be able to take that?
Sure can. So many of you are aware that things are mostly at a standstill. The only meaningful thing that is proceeding forward is a bill that will require OHA to conduct a cost of dispense survey. Doesn't really have any huge impacts to P&T, but certainly does to our staff. That's all the legislative update I can provide right now, but hopefully next meeting we'll be able to provide a summary of what has happened since sine die.
Any questions for Trevor? Appreciate it, Trevor. As I mentioned at the top of the order, the P&T committee also serves as the DUR board, which is federally mandated for states that elect to cover prescription medications. Oregon does, clearly. So we will have the quarterly utilization report as part of our consent agenda, and we'll do some DUR activities in a moment. But we do have a standing consent agenda that includes policy updates just to our oncology and orphan drug policies. So entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Sorry, I forgot to
All-
end. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Abstain? Thank you.
Great. Again, if you're following on the packet, we're at page 30, and we're going to go over to the prospective DUR report, and I'm going to turn it over to Lan.
Thank you, Roger. So I'll wait for Sarah to post that. Okay, so here is the prospective DUR report for the first quarter of 23. On the left side, you can see the DUR alert. The second column shows the example of what those alerts are like, and then the disposition for the claims. So there are 12 different ProDUR reviews that are screened for prescription drug claims. These identify the drug patient precaution due to allergies, disease, age, drug-drug interaction, ingredient and therapeutic duplication. So for the quarter, we had over 155,000 claims total. Just a reminder, 10 of these alerts are informational and the claim is set to pay, while 2 is set to deny, and those are highlighted in yellow. So for the early refill, the edit is set at 80%, so that's the threshold. The claim will deny when a previously filled 30-day supply is trying to be refilled after 24 days. We had over 98,000 early refill alerts for the quarter. 19,000 were overridden, so the percent of overrides is 19.6%. And then for the pregnancy drug interaction alert, so this occurs when something like Accutane, which is teratogenic, is billed for a patient who recently had a pregnancy history. These alerts are often false positive. Typically, pharmacists will override these alerts. So 21 total for the quarter, 18 were overridden. Next page, please. So this page shows the top drug enforced in the early refill alert. They are broken down to the different types of therapeutic class, and they are sorted by the most alerts to the least. The class with the highest alert is the antidepressant. So I've broken it down to the SSRIs on top, followed by the non-SSRIs. So we had a total of 22,000 alerts for the SSRIs. And then for the non-SSRI antidepressant, we had 24,000 alerts. So the average percent override for the antidepressant class overall was 17.5%. And you can see that on the last column. The third box is the second generation antipsychotic. This is the second largest class after the antidepressants for the early refill alerts. 13,000 were received for the top 4 antipsychotics: quetiapine, aripiprazole, olanzapine, and risperidone. The average percent override for this class is 21.9 for those top 4. Then I included the other carve-out medication, the anxiolytics. The primary one here is the buspirone that has the most significant of the group. The other ones I included is also the benzodiazepine. While they don't have a lot of alerts in terms of numbers, they have the highest percent of overrides. And this is about 25% for the class of the benzodiazepines. And then lastly, the final box just shows the other carve-out medication with many early refill alerts. So the lamotrigine and the guanfacine ER. I've included Suboxone for the Drug Utilization Review Safety Ed as part of the Support Act. Next page, please. So this page just shows the breakdown, the monthly breakdown of the early refill reason code. The top will show you the submission clarification code. So as you can see, the submission clarification code medically necessary number 7 has the highest amount at 68.5% of the overrides. Then we have submission clarification code 5, which is due to change in therapy at 16.8%. And then the third highest one would be 6% due to lost medication, and that's a submission clarification code of 4. Next page, please. And then lastly, this is just the cost savings report for the ProDer alerts. So this is just showing the different types of alerts where where the pharmacy did not dispense the medication due to the ProDer alert. For the month of January, 46 prescriptions were not dispensed. The total for that is $9,351. February, we had 73 prescriptions that were not dispensed. That's over $16,000 in cost savings. And then lastly, for March, we had 150 prescriptions that were not dispensed, totaling over $37,000 in cost savings. So the overall cost savings for the state for the quarter is $62,869.10. Any questions?
Thank you, Lan. Any questions on the prospective DUR? Great. We'll turn your attention to page 34 in the packet. So after ProDer, which is happening at the point of sale before the claims are adjudicated and paid, we look at claims and we do retrospective DUR. Turn it over to Dave Engen.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. Yeah, as Roger pointed out, these are prescriptions that have already been dispensed and paid for by fee-for-service. And so in this section, we'll review prescribing trends and dispensing practices and medication use through the DUR process. On page 34, we're looking at Q2 data. I'll just hit the high points. The first section highlights our ongoing initiatives with change forms. So this is aripiprazole, desvenlafaxine, and venlafaxine. We're seeing continued opportunity with changes to the more cost-effective desvenlafaxine form. And then there's an uptick, it looks like, with the aripiprazole rapid tab switches. But we also noticed a downward trend with the venlafaxine tabs to caps. So we may consider turning that one off soon. But once again, if any frontline pharmacists on the committee know of additional opportunities that we may be missing, please let us know. We're constantly combing through and looking for those opportunities. So yeah, page 35. It's our prescriber messaging about dose consolidation. Presently, relatively few claims identified because now most of this is going on at point of sale with Gainwell's new system. So not a whole lot to report there, but page 36, this is our expert consultation referral for long-term antipsychotic use in kids. The number of the patients that were identified as high risk is about the same as for Q2 as it was Q1, but you'll see there's been a significant drop in overall long-term use, it appears. So we'll see if that trend continues next time. Page 37. This is our messaging for non-adherence to antipsychotics. And those numbers are holding steady as well. About half the patients refilling for an antipsychotic in the next 90 days after the prescriber was notified. That's encouraging. Page 38. Once again, this lists the different individual profile reviews that are going on and lettering that goes out when it's appropriate. And so you can see the various numbers there. Page 39, that's our safety net program for antipsychotics in the really young kids. What we do, we proactively notify the prescribers to submit a PA for their patient and tell them what will be required so those patients get the appropriate care with no interruptions in therapy. See the numbers there are pretty consistent. Page 40. This is safety net monitoring. The first one is for patients on dangerous opioid sedative combos, and there's a slight uptick in those. We also notify if a patient's been denied on oncology med with no evidence of a new fill for an alternative agent. And then we do the same thing for prescribers whose pediatric patients were denied a TCA, but no alternative was filled or requested. See the numbers there as well. So still quite a bit going on in this space, but we're always looking for new opportunities. So once again, gladly welcome any new ideas the committee has and whenever they come to mind. And that's all I have for now. If there aren't any questions, I'll just turn it over back to Roger.
Any questions about our RetroDUR program or some of the initiatives that were just described? Okay, hearing none. Another part of DUR that's required is education. And one of the ways that we accomplish this is through our newsletters, the Oregon State Drug Reviews. Kathy Centena is our editor. We're starting on page 41 in the packet.
Great, thanks, Roger. Today we'll be recapping 3 newsletters, two that were published last year, and then one that was published earlier this year. The first one, Pharmacological Prevention and Treatment of Monkeypox, was published in October of 2022. And this is actually on page 44, a little bit out of order here, but this newsletter provides an overview of monkeypox infection and vaccine treatment options for prevention and treatment of the disease. And then the next newsletter, published in November, was an update on hormone replacement therapy. And this was focusing on the benefits and risk of estrogen therapy, as well as highlighting 2 new products, Bijuva and Imvexxy. And then the third newsletter, titled Early and Periodic Screening, Diagnostic and Treatment Benefit for Children and Adolescents, was published in January of 2023. And this newsletter discusses the changes to the EPSDT coverage for those that are 1 year up to their 21st birthday, and then updates some of the prior authorizations to reflect these changes. Again, thanks so much to the authors who assist in providing these important provider education pieces, as well as the committee who also provides such valuable feedback and suggestions. You can receive these newsletters by signing up on our website to receive them electronically. And then, of course, at this time, I'd like to solicit the committee if there's anyone that has any topics that they'd like us to look into that may be of interest to our providers.
Always welcoming, topics for newsletters from the committee. Great, thank you, Kathy. We're going to move on to our operating procedures. So again, in the packet, this I believe is on page 50, and we can turn over to Sarah Fletcher to describe the changes.
Yes, thanks, Roger. Our P&T operating procedures are something that we bring yearly to the committee, and we're bringing it a second time because we're doing some additional edits or recommending some additional edits. If you go to, this is page 50 in the packet, a little bit further down under the duties, number 4, we've added some additional clarification that all of the meeting materials, including this recording, are publicly available, and they remain publicly available in perpetuity after the meeting. Additionally, comments such as draft comments that only go to the author of one of our written reviews, those are subject to Oregon Public Records law. So we want to remind people not to include any kind of identifiable personal health information in any kind of comments that we receive. If you scroll to the next page on 51 under the ad hoc subject matter committee, in rule, there's stipulations for the P&T committee to have the ability to appoint an ad hoc subject matter expert that would be a voting member for a single topic being discussed. And that would be based on current clinical and treatment expertise of the committee. And we've added some additional information and language around that in our operating procedures to clarify the process, particularly because in rule it's stipulated that this can be requested by outside parties. So we have added an email address for being able to make recommendations or requests for us to consider adding this, as well as clarifying that these members would be under the same stipulations as current P&T members for things such as requirements, duties, and responsibilities. That includes conflicts of interest, as well as meeting the requirements of our medical or pharmacy P&T or medical and pharmacy P&T committee members that they are actively practicing and licensed in Oregon. 2 and 3 are essentially clerical edits under this section as well. And then if we go to page 52 under the conduct of meetings, we've added some additional language just in clarification, since these are online meetings now, and it's a little bit of a different process, just to state that these should be inclusive, welcoming, and respectful, and then just expectations on behavior. If we were to have a problem, we do have the ability to mute participants. And if anyone does have any concerns on how any meetings have been conducted, that there's a feedback mechanism or feedback loop with this. Any of the other changes that you see below are essentially clerical. Under the conflict of interest policy, we did clarify that conflicts of interest would be assessed annually, and that we do need to be notified of any changes if they happen with committee members. And that is essentially all I have for the operating procedures. Is not voting, but are there any questions or comments from the P&T committee members?
Everybody checking.
I'm seeing Tim shake his head, so.
Nope. Tim's given us acknowledgement, so.
Okay.
Appreciate it, Sarah. Thank you very much. We're also going to look at evidence methods. As you are aware, we've discussed in the past that the Mental Health Clinical Advisory Group is advisory to the P&T committee. So we've included some information from their group. Let's turn your attention to page 56 in the packet and turn it over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Roger. Yeah, there were some great questions at the last meeting about the MCAG and their role with the P&T committee. So we wanted to bring this information forward and share it with you. It's nothing that we vote on, but it's something that I think you would be interested in knowing a little bit more about. And as Roger said, the MCAG is mandated by statute to develop evidence-based treatment guidelines for mental health disorders. And so what you see on page 56 of the packet, that first section there is straight out of the bills that were passed and what the legislature had asked the MCAG to do in their development of treatment guidance, what they can use to develop those treatment guidance documents, and that the MCAG can make recommendations to this committee on implementation of these treatment guidance or algorithms, any changes to the preferred drug list, and practice guidelines for the treatment of mental health disorders with mental health drugs. And those drugs are the carve-out drugs that you are probably already aware of, class 7 and class 11 of the standard therapeutic classes, and in addition to lamotrigine and divalproax. So the committee consists of 18 members, and there are 2 psychiatrists, a child and adolescent psychiatrists, 2 clinical psychologists, a psychiatric nurse practitioner, 2 primary care providers, 2 pharmacists, 2 individuals that represent statewide mental health advocacy organizations who have experience in mental health, experienced mental health services in Oregon, or who have a family who has, 2 individuals representing CCOs, consumer of mental health services, a member of the federally recognized Oregon Tribal Nation, a Department of Corrections, and a clinical psychiatrist who represents OPAL, or the Oregon Psychiatric Access Line. And so in 2021, we decided we better develop more robust methods in the development of these documents so that they truly are based off of good, sound clinical evidence. And so we developed these methods on the next page. And if they look familiar, that's because they probably are. They're adopted from the same methods that the DERM uses that we developed several years back. So the first process, of course, is to develop good clinical research questions that define the scope of the research, and then identify high quality systematic reviews. And we do have trusted sources that we use that we do not need to individually evaluate their quality for. And those sources are, for MCAG, it's the DERM group, or the DERP group, the Drug Effectiveness Review Project, AHRQ, CADTH, NICE, and the VA, Department of Defense. Otherwise, systematic reviews are quality assessed using the AmStar 2 criteria. That's in Appendix 1. We also identify high quality randomized controlled trials if we need them. And those trials are assessed, the quality of those trials are assessed using the modified Cochrane risk to bias tool that you will see in Appendix 2. And then from there, the MCAG will go down the evidence pyramid in order to see what has been published if there's a lack of evidence from systematic reviews or clinical controlled trials. Their focus is on the people of Oregon, so they prioritize studies that evaluate U.S. populations, and they will pay specific attention to any studies that include populations that have been historically marginalized in the current healthcare system. And then lastly, they will identify high quality clinical practice guidelines, and those guidelines quality of those guidelines are assessed using the AGREE tool in Appendix 3. And then from there, they grade the evidence for each outcome, similar to what the DERM group does. So there'll be evidence will range from very low to high quality evidence for each outcome assessed. So that is a brief review of the methods behind MCAG and a little bit about their background and why you might be seeing more and more guidance documents being presented to this committee, just so you're aware of those efforts to see how they align with the current fee-for-service policy. What questions do you have?
Thank you. Well done.
Appreciate it, Bill. Again, the Mental Health Clinical Advisory Group develops these treatment algorithms. They're a freestanding group, and they make these available for potentially or primarily primary care physicians to help with their treatment. But there are times within those conversations where they'll come to us with requests for coverage, and that'll be one of the topics a little later in the agenda today. So that's really kind of a description of how we interact. So thank you, Andrew. Along these same lines with the methods, we're going to bring forward some of ours. Page 67 in the packet, and Sarah Fletcher, turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Roger. I just have 2 more edits on this one in line with what Andrew said, in addition to changing the date at the top to June. We are adding a prior authorization update. This is something that we've been doing for a while. It's an update that we would do without doing a full class review, simply because of some kind of change with a HERC guideline, like funding or a guideline note. Some kind of recommendation from MCAG like we've had with the pregabalin, or in situations where there's been a labeling expansion that we can't change with some kind of simple clerical error edit, and we can maybe review one study and include that in just a PA update, such as with dupilumab, which we've done in the past, instead of doing the entire class update at that time, because they're a little bit more nimble for making those kinds of changes. And then if you'll go to the next page on number 7, similar to the methods that you just saw from Andrew, where he has his trusted sources, and we're on that list, we're adding MCAG to our list of trusted sources. And that is all I have for our methods here.
Again, it doesn't require a vote, but are there any questions for Sarah? All right, we're cruising right along. We're going to turn it over to DUR new business. Will be the low-dose quetiapine, and Andrew, turn it back over to you.
Yeah, and so one of the, as we talked about MCAG and that the legislature's mandated that they develop these treatment algorithms, they did recently publish a treatment algorithm for generalized anxiety disorder, and that was briefly reviewed by this committee at the last meeting, and it's also in the packet as an appendix to this quetiapine document, just for background information. And within that treatment algorithm, pregabalin is recommended as an adjunctive treatment after failing multiple trials of an SSRI or an SNRI. But also quetiapine extended release is one of several third-line adjunctive treatment options. Current fee-for-service policy doesn't permit use of pregabalin or low-dose quetiapine at doses of 50 milligrams a day or less, because of the current prior authorizations in place, which are really meant to target unfunded conditions. So they don't recognize generalized anxiety disorder as a condition that could be treated by pregabalin. And for that matter, quetiapine at doses of 50 milligrams a day or less. Fee-for-service does have open coverage of higher doses than 50 milligrams per day, but it's the PA in place does target lower doses to really ensure that we're not using a lot of it for unfunded conditions like insomnia. But as you know, people with anxiety disorders may need to start on a low dose initially just so because it's better tolerated, and figure out what the appropriate dose is as they titrate up. So in April, this committee recommended the derm review use of pregabalin and gabapentin, which will be brought back to the committee later. And I put together this summary that provides more details of behind the data of the recommendations for quetiapine ER as a third line adjunctive treatment for GAD. So very, very not used often, but it is a treatment option if it's really needed. And so there were 4 high quality systematic reviews that were identified by the MCAG that evaluate the efficacy and tolerability of quetiapine extended release for treatment of GAD, or generalized anxiety disorder. And most of the studies evaluated treatment response, which is defined as a greater than 50% or greater reduction in the Hamilton Anxiety Scale, or HAM-A, you might see it referred to as. And they also looked at remission of GAD, which is defined as a HAM-A score of 7 or less. And overall, the systematic reviews found that quetiapine increases the chance of a patient experiencing a treatment response or remission from GAD by about 25% higher relative to placebo. But there was also a 3 to 4-fold higher rate of discontinuing quetiapine ER because of the adverse effects, which are very well known to probably this committee and anyone that's ever treated someone with quetiapine. We know, the MCAG has concluded that quetiapine ER is not well tolerated in people with GAD, but there is moderate quality evidence that quetiapine extended release improves anxiety symptoms and helps people achieve remission. And in that effort, in case there is, or there are people in Oregon that could benefit from quetiapine if it were to be prescribed for GAD, that we update the clinical prior authorization criteria for those low dose quetiapine so that people can get started on a lower dose for generalized anxiety disorder. And so that is the conclusion of this presentation of this quick low dose quetiapine review.
I have a question. This is Erica. Does it have to be ER? What if just a plain quetiapine?
Yeah, I think in theory you would think both would work just as well as the other, but all that's been studied has been the extended release formulation, and it is helpful because it's only dosed once a day versus twice a day, and but that immediate release has not been studied. But that does not necessarily mean it might not work. We just don't have the evidence to say one way or the other.
So the ER only need the prior authorization. If it's not ER, you don't need it. Is that?
Well, I think the recommendation for the PA is to allow fee for service to auto approve doses of quetiapine extended release for if they have a background SSRI or SNR, which would likely indicate that they have major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, and just to let those go through instead of PAing. And as is written now, there would be no coverage, pathway to coverage for quetiapine for generalized anxiety disorder. So we would allow that pathway to coverage. The provider would have to appeal that or use a higher dose to get around that.
Bill, calling you in 1 second. And just to confirm, we have the PA is only on the low dose, so 50 milligrams or less for the extended release or the immediate release quetiapine. Otherwise, dosed above that, quetiapine, immediate or extended release are available unrestricted. So this is describing coverage that potentially would be automated for that low dose of the extended release. And we'll get into the PA and we'll show that to you in a moment. Bill, your question?
Oh, is now time to comment on the PA, or is that later?
Roger, do you want to do that later?
We'll do it yeah, let's hold that for 1 second, because we are accompanying some of those changes with a DUE, a drug use evaluation. So any other questions for Andrew before we turn it over to Sarah Servet?
Well, this is Russ. This is just, it's such a weird situation where, I mean, the pharmacokinetics between the extended release quetiapine and the immediate release quetiapine are extremely similar. The adverse events are extremely similar, like the rate of them is extremely similar. I mean, they are so so similar. I mean, it's almost like lithium and controlled release lithium. Like the ER version almost doesn't have a reason to exist, except for the fact that because the manufacturer at one point attempted to get an FDA indication for GAD, now there's all this research that the ER version works for GAD when the immediate release version works just as well, even dosed once a day. And I mean, really the only difference between the two of them is the immediate release version, the sedation for some people kicks in a few hours later. But we don't have the research. Like clinically, we know that this is true, but no one's ever researched the immediate release version. So we don't have the clinical evidence to support it. But, you know, based on the pharmacokinetics, we know that they should work. And clinically, we know that they do work virtually identically. So, I mean, I'm all for it because I think, you know, the more treatments we have for GAD, it's an extremely difficult condition to treat. But it's weird to me that, you know, we're only doing the immediate release version, but I understand there just isn't the research. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
I'd pay more than that. Thank you, Russ. Any other questions or comments? All right, thanks, Andrew. Draw your attention to page 93 in the packet, and we'll turn it over to Sarah Servid.
Thanks. So one of the things that we had done was take a look at our utilization and our policy for our low dose quetiapine, since we did have this recommendation from the Mental Health Clinical Advisory Group. So I'm going to go through some of that data now. And Andrew covered this pretty well, but our current policy is that anything that's less than or equal to 50 milligrams daily will stop for PA. And the kind of historical context with this is trying to discourage off-label use for sleep conditions, for which the risks with quetiapine outweigh the benefits. The IR formulation is currently preferred. The ER formulation is non-preferred. Previous reviews haven't identified clinical differences between the two. And so those recommendations have historically been based on cost. Both are available as generics now. We do currently automatically approve requests for people who have a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder in their medical claims history. We approve requests automatically for people who have a history of a second generation antipsychotic. So if this is their second antipsychotic that they're trying, those requests will be automatically approved, and we automatically approve requests from mental health specialists. So that's our current policy. And so the questions that we were trying to look for in this drug evaluation were looking at how many members had those compendia supported diagnoses, how many members were prescribed other mental health medications in addition to the quetiapine, because we know quetiapine is often second line in something like major depressive disorder or anxiety, and then also looking at who is prescribing these medications. Again, a little bit of background that I'll go through quickly. You probably already are very aware of what these are FDA approved for: bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and adjunct treatment for depression. Andrew just went over the evidence for anxiety disorder, and current guidelines do not recommend quetiapine for sleep conditions, which is why we have this low dose PEA. And maintenance dosing for all these conditions is typically more than 50 milligrams daily. People just might start out with that lower dose and then titrate up. And the MCAG recommendations we've covered already, and you're aware that these have numerous side effects. So quetiapine isn't necessarily well tolerated by everyone. So what we were looking at with this, the data that's presented here, was a year-long period. The baseline period that we were looking at was 6 months before the first claim for each member, and we chose that 6-month period because we wanted to see what diagnosis they had in medical claims. The follow-up period was defined as the 3 months after the index event. And then we wanted to capture both paid and denied claims for low-dose quetiapine. And so we're looking at diagnoses, who is prescribing them, and then other mental health drugs. And we did exclude people where they were prescribed more than 50 milligrams daily for that first claim. And then anyone for which we thought we probably wouldn't have complete claims data. And the people that were included in this study were mostly female adults who identified as white or where they didn't identify race when they signed up for Medicaid. Of note, about 96% of people had prescriptions for the immediate release formulations rather than the extended release formulations. About 37% had claims for less than 25 milligrams. And denied claims were more common with that lower dose compared to people that had claims for 50 milligrams daily. And about 76% of members had an initial paid claim or a paid claim within 1 day of the denial. And so most people are getting automatic approvals under this criteria. About 67% of people did have an evidence-supported diagnosis in their medical claims. So about 45% had major depressive disorder, 26% had generalized anxiety disorder, about 26% had a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and 3% had schizophrenia diagnosis. And you will notice that those percentages don't add up to 69%. And so there is a lot of overlap in people having more than one diagnosis in their medical claims that could be potential indications for treatment. Of members who had denied claims rather than a initial paid claim, denied claims were more common for people with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. And as you'd expect, they were also more common for people that didn't have an evidence-supported diagnosis. And that is consistent with our current policy where we automatically approve requests in people with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. But that the denied claims in people with major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder might be medically appropriate, but they do still have an initial denied claim. There was a small portion of people who had a sleep disorder in the absence of one of these other diagnoses that would be evidence-supported indications for therapy, which I thought might be, I was expecting a higher number than that. I thought that was a pretty low percentage, but that might be influenced by the fact that diagnoses such as insomnia are unfunded, and so providers might not put those diagnoses on their claims for medical billing. And so that might be an underrepresentation of people who have sleep disorders. As far as other medications, for people with claims for quetiapine, about 76% had previous claims for another antipsychotic. About half had claims for an SSRI or SNRI. 35% had tried some other type of antidepressant, and 22% had claims for a benzodiazepine. Of note, most people who had an initial paid claim for the low-dose quetiapine also had claims for an antipsychotic, so 99%. And so this, if people have an initial paid claim, it's not the first antipsychotic that they're trying. And this might be, well, I'll get into some of the limitations later, but it might be a factor of the population that we identified with this data and some of our inclusion and exclusion criteria that might be driving that number. It might also be a factor of how our system works and identifying claims for automatic approval. Pharmacy claims are a little bit more real time than medical claims, and so that might generate more auto approvals based on that pharmacy data compared to medical data. In members with denied claims, 40% of members with a denied claim did have a recent claim for an SSRI or SNRI. And about 38% of members who had a denied claim didn't have any other history that we could see for mental health medications. And most of these medications are coming from non-specialist prescribers. So only 36% of members with a low-dose quetiapine claim were prescribed a medication from a mental health provider. So one of the things that is a limitation for all claims data is potentially incomplete or inaccurate diagnoses. We only see diagnoses that providers submit to us for billing, and so that might not necessarily reflect the diagnoses that members actually have. And many patients had more than one potentially relevant diagnosis, and so it's difficult to discern exactly why quetiapine was being prescribed. Additionally, provider types could be inaccurate, and that's always true with claims data, and we can never see what portion of providers get a consultation with a mental health provider before they prescribe the low-dose quetiapine. We can only see who is actually prescribing, and we classify their prescriber type based on what provider type they sign up for when they sign up for Medicaid. Pharmacy claims might not actually reflect, true utilization, and the exclusion criteria that we use to identify this data, excluding anyone who we thought might not have complete claims data, could limit the applicability and might influence some of the results that we saw here. But based on the data that we saw and the recommendations from MCAG, we are recommending updating our PA criteria for low-dose quetiapine to incorporate generalized anxiety disorder. And then because we did see more denied claims in members who had a diagnosis of depression or a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder, even if they already had an SSRI or SNRI on file, there's a higher rate of denials in that population. And so we're recommending also to automatically approve PA requests, specifically for the extended release quetiapine in members who have that recent history of an SSRI or SNRI, since antipsychotics can be used as adjunct add-on therapy if there's not complete remission or not adequate symptom improvement with that initial first-line treatment. And then this isn't in the original packet, and I'd like to get everyone's opinion on this, but currently we do have immediate release quetiapine as a preferred product, extended release as a non-preferred product, and there's not a lot of difference in price at this point. They're both generic, and we are recommending automatically approving requests for the extended release quetiapine, and so considering making the extended release formulation preferred as well, but still subject to this low safety criteria for low dose. So before I get into the specific PA changes, I want to stop there and see if there are questions. Okay, hearing none. This outlines the PA changes that we're proposing. So essentially adding generalized anxiety disorder to this table of compendia supported indications. Previously, it only included FDA approved indications, and it is recommended as adjunct with an SSRI or SNRI. And then this is more of a clerical change, but modifying, instead of asking in this first question what diagnosis is being treated, asking is it one of the FDA approved or compendia supported diagnoses in question 1, and if yes, then they can continue through the criteria. And then in question 4, kind of just consolidating that diagnosis information up into question 1, and so they can get lower doses in specific circumstances. So if they need a low dose due to debilitation from a medical condition, if they're unable to tolerate higher doses, if the low dose is actually working for them, even if it's not what we typically think of as a therapeutic dose, or if there's impaired drug clearance. In any of those circumstances, they can continue on that lower dose and get an approval for a year. So those are the changes that we're recommending. And in this criteria of note, even though we're automatically only recommending automatic approval of the extended release, this PA criteria doesn't distinguish between extended release and immediate release formulations. And so if a provider did request immediate release for generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorder, there is a pathway to coverage for the immediate release for those conditions with this criteria. And again, I'll open it to questions.
Go for it, Bill. You're still on mute, though.
Keep losing my cursor on my 3 screens. One thing that I would like to delete is the automatic PA for a mental health provider. We don't exempt anyone generally from evidence-based PA requirements, and cardiologists and rheumatologists have to get PA for drugs within their areas expertise, and I really don't want to go down that pathway, because then everybody's going to want an exception and we then can't enforce the evidence.
We do make exceptions though for like pediatric neurologists, or there is another group, and it escapes me, but that we've reviewed at some point in the last year where consultation with an oncologist or a neurologist was a basis for an exclusion. So I mean, I think there are other groups.
There's a difference here. Consultation, I have no argument with that. As a family medicine doctor, I need the help of specialists in lots and lots of cases. But if our decisions are evidence-based, they should apply to everyone who writes a prescription, because evidence is based on the characteristics of the patient, what the research shows, and then how the practitioner prescribing interprets the needs of that individual patient within the realm of evidence. And there's a difference between consultation and lack of criteria, or skipping the criteria. And if the criteria are accurate, it should apply to everybody, and those who know the most will have the least trouble with it.
Hey, Russ and Bill, I think the difference is the auto PA function. So in lots of other criteria we have in consultation with, and that's verified at the time that the PA is submitted. But in this case, it would not require submission. It would just simply be auto approved if the prescription was written by a mental health provider. So I think that's the difference, maybe, Russ, in some of the other things that we do. I can't think of a time where we auto PA simply based on the person prescribing. Maybe I'm wrong, but I can't think of a situation. Doesn't mean that it won't get approved, right? So if it's in consultation with a specialist, generally those are going to get approved pretty easily, but it still has to go through the process.
And that's fair. I mean, I would tend to lean the other way, which is that if you are an expert within a subject matter, that we should probably, provide you the benefit of the doubt unless evidence tells us otherwise. I mean, my concern is that, the people that I'm treating with low dose quetiapine, which is a small handful out of the, several hundred patients that I see regularly, is, I am seeing the most severe patients who have tried the most, prior trials, without success. And so, I am using 4th and 5th and 6th line treatments with some small percentage of patients, because, you know, that's what you end up doing. And so while I appreciate that the PA would eventually be approved, it is also unnecessary because it's, I mean, as a mental health professional with, you know, I only use this in situations where it's warranted. So, but, you know, that's just, you know, like I said, as a provider, I think we should generally provide, you know, give experts some matter of leeway within their subject matter, unless we have evidence to the contrary.
I take the opposite view. I think everyone should observe evidence, and the experts do know the complexities and see the complex patients, but they also can generally justify to us why these standard things don't work. The chance for this particular policy being abused is very small, but I do not want to set the precedent, because the next thing we're going to have is every specialty saying, well, we know our stuff, we should be able to prescribe. And I don't think we want to go there.
I'm not sure why that would be a problem, though. I mean, if we are assuming that providers are doing this within their area of expertise.
I think experience shows us otherwise, that there are times when people are strongly influenced by the pharmaceutical industry in promoting certain drugs that are probably appropriate, but not the first choice. And we have to stick with the evidence.
On that front, I would definitely agree with you. I mean, there's a surprisingly robust amount of evidence on, you know, the ability for irrational prescribing in relation to advertisements, be they in human form or printed. But I mean, at least, you know, but that is, I think, not what this would necessarily be addressing. And, you know, I mean, the fact that Caplyta is prescribed as much as it is based on the evidence of its efficacy is a secondary issue, but that wouldn't be addressed by, you know, limiting the ability to get a PA for, you know, because we don't, the PAs that we have for mental health meds are based on safety edits, right?
I'm going to insist on this from a different perspective also. Our job is to protect the patient and make sure the patient gets the right drug, and that in unusual circumstances, those who need it get it. Our job is not to make the world smoother for physicians, even though we shouldn't be unnecessarily harsh. And I think this is just a really bad precedent to say that certain people are exempt from evidence. Because that's what we're saying. We're saying, oh, you're an expert, so you can prescribe whatever you want. And that is not a policy that we have ever supported, even in much more specialized cases.
Well, I would even say that it's not necessarily the case that this is contrary to the evidence. I mean, because what the evidence tells us is that it is effective. It's just also carries a lot of significant risks, and that's where the expertise comes in, right? Is identifying the patients where that risk benefit balance changes based on the individual patient characteristics. And so, I mean, there is evidence that these medications work. They work as sleep aids. They work for GAD. They just have a lot of risks. And so, I mean, so there is evidence to support them as being effective for this use in a select group of people.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. It's well documented, but we need to stick to the characteristics of the patient, not who's pushing the computer button. I would say that you know that the vast majority of these drugs are not prescribed by psychiatrists, and some of my colleagues who are 100 miles away from the nearest psychiatrist and who are forced to take care of all these people would take great offense at this distinguishing characteristic.
One point of clarification. This is not a change that we're bringing forward. This is in the existing criteria, and it's in a couple of our criteria. So we're not proposing adding that, but you're bringing up a point nonetheless that I'd like to hear from the other committee members on, have some dialogue, and if then we would entertain a motion separately from the other requests or the other changes that we're proposing here, just to keep those distinct. But any comment on that, Bill, or open it up to other committee members?
I think you know what I've said enough. I think I'd like to hear what everybody else says, and if I'm in the minority, so be it, but I don't know that yet.
Doug, I see you unmuted.
I have a question. Why the low dose? Why do we have to even do the PA? I guess that's my question. This is
Again, because of the side effect profile and it's being used as a sleep aid. And so in those instances, when there may be a more appropriate alternatives, it's trying to blunt that. That was the reasoning behind it initially.
It is used surprisingly often as a sleep aid, more so than it should be.
But if somebody have already used the SSRIs or SNRIs, they will be covered, right?
That's what we're proposing now is the SSRIs or SNRIs, that would be in the claims history, a trigger that we would auto approve that low dose. But currently, even though they have an SSRI, a history, or an SNRI, that prescription would require prior authorization. Doug?
I agree with Bill on this. I think we should strike that auto PA. I think it ought to undergo a review regardless of who's prescribing.
Appreciate that. Eddie?
Just to clarify, the discussion is, the proposal is just adding the fourth criteria to the auto PA, is that right? Does the auto PA currently exist for the first three?
It does, yes.
Okay.
Other questions or comments?
Hey, Roger, this is Andrew, and I just want to, this PA has been in place since 2011, so about 12 years now. And I think that, I don't know when that language about prescriptions identified as being written by a mental health provider has been in there, but it's been in there for several years. I think it's just been noticed now for the first time, maybe.
That's true. I was not aware of that, or I would have spoken up much sooner. And for that I have responsibility. But I don't suffer in silence.
Other questions or comments? Let's start with the recommendations that are in front of the committee. Update the PA criteria for the low dose to incorporate GAD, automatically approve for the extended release quetiapine if there's recent claims for the SSRI or SNRI, and to make the quetiapine ER a preferred agent.
So moved.
Thank you, Doug.
Yes.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Thank you.
All right, now, Bill, it sounds like you want to make a motion.
I would move to strike the exemption for a specific type of provider. And in this case, it's mental health.
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Oops, sorry. Opposed?
Aye.
Nay.
Okay, so opposed was Russ and
Eddie.
Eddie. Okay. Anybody abstain? Okay, if I heard right, I think the ayes have it.
Stacy, you were an aye as well, so we have 2 nays and the remainder of ayes.
Yes.
I always
Okay.
I get my ayes and nays confused. I don't oppose things very often.
Yeah.
I'm usually so agreeable.
Okay. Good discussion. Anything, I think we probably put a bow on this one.
Yes, I think so.
All
too.
right. We'll move on in the packet. 107 is if you're following along in the posted packet, and we'll turn it over to Deanna.
Thank you, Roger. So we're going to be talking about omaveloxolone or Skylaris. If we could go to the next slide, please. This drug was the first medication approved in the United States to treat Friedreich's ataxia. There were no other FDA-approved treatments for this condition. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So Friedreich's ataxia is a rare progressive autosomal recessive neurodegenerative disorder. It generally presents before the age of 20 with impaired ataxia, but it can progress in most patients to cardiomyopathy, diabetes, and vision and hearing loss. Most of the early onset patients will be wheelchair bound by their late teens or early 20s. Unfortunately, the mean age of death is around 37 years. Although some patients with late onset ataxia have survived until they reached 80. The major cause of death is congestive heart failure or cardiac arrhythmia, and that's due to the impaired mitochondrial function and overproduction of free radicals. We could go to the next slide, please. So before we get into the trial, I wanted to talk about what was used for the primary outcome in the pivotal trial to approve this drug. So the first rating scale for this condition is called Friedreich's Ataxia Rating Scale, and that was basically developed to assess the severity of ataxia. The minimum score is 25 points, and that's based on 5 different sections that measure the ability to move in different parts of the body. For the pivotal trial, the investigators used the modified Friedreich's Ataxia Rating Scale, and that includes 4 of the 5 sections in the FAR scale. Peripheral nervous system function was not assessed in the modified screening. So for the modified score, the range is from 0 to 99. A lower score indicates better neurologic function and less physical impairment. 5-year natural history studies showed that mean progression in the mFAR scores from baseline was approximately 2 points per year. We could go to the next slide, please. So omaveloxolone is an activator of nuclear factor erythroid-derived 2 related factor signaling, which is involved in the cellular response to oxidative stress. The FDA-approved indication is for treatments of Friedreich's ataxia in adults and adolescents aged 16 years and older. The approval for this was with priority review with orphan drug status and rare pediatric disease designation. As you can imagine, this is a rare disease. And then the dose is 50 milligrams or 3 capsules once a day, at least 1 hour before eating. So next slide, please. So the clinical efficacy was based on results from a 2-part multi-center placebo-controlled double-blind phase 2 trial, the MOXIE trial. In the first part of the study, it was a dose-ranging escalation assessment in which various omaveloxolone doses were assessed, ranging from 2.5 milligrams all the way up to 300 milligrams compared to placebo. Most improvement was observed with the 160 milligram dose. So that's why 150 milligrams was used as the comparator in this trial of the omaveloxolone. It's very important that patients prescribed omaveloxolone are able to swallow because the capsules cannot be opened, crushed, or chewed. They're designed to be swallowed whole. So you can see there were 103 people that were enrolled. This was conducted at 11 different sites. Most of those sites were in the United States, 7 of those. The demographics, about half of them were male. Most of them were white. The mean age was 24 years. And you can see the inclusion criteria there. They were 16 to 40 years of age with genetically confirmed Friedreich's ataxia. They had a stable mFARS score between 20 and 80, able to swallow pills, and able to complete maximal exercise on a recumbent bicycle. About 92% were ambulatory. And then the exclusion was if they had uncontrolled diabetes, if they had significant cardiac disease, significant hepatic disease, or significant lab abnormalities, in particular a BNP greater than 200. And the duration of the study was over 48 weeks. I do want to point out that the baseline characteristics were slightly unbalanced between the two groups. Compared with the placebo cohort, the omaveloxolone cohort had patients with higher baseline mFARS scores. They tended to have more mutations in the Fraxton gene, which is the gene that causes this disorder. And it did seem that people in the active comparator group had more severe disease and more advanced cardiac disease. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about the results for just a minute. Of note, patients with pes cavus, which is a musculoskeletal foot deformity that's characterized by a high arch of the foot that doesn't flatten with weight bearing, that may represent a subtype of Friedreich's ataxia. And the presence of pes cavus makes it difficult for people to use their legs or walk, or perform the neurologic testing that's independent of the ataxia. So in this trial, patients with pes cavus were limited to 20% of the total study enrollment due to possible phenotypic differences. And so the randomization was stratified by the status of pes cavus. Either they had it or they didn't. So the full analysis population for the primary outcome of change from baseline to over 48 weeks in the modified Friedreich's ataxia scale was 82 patients. So you can see 40 patients got the omaveloxolone and 42 got placebo. Now, previous studies have shown that patients with Friedreich's ataxia do decline on average by 1 to 2 points on the FAR clinical rating scale per year. So based on these studies, improvement was defined by the investigators as a change in the baseline mFARS score of 1.9 points or less. So the clinical significance of a 2-point change on the 99-point scale is based on those natural history assessments, but a minimal clinically important difference has not been defined for this scale. So at 48 weeks, low quality evidence showed the mean mFARS score improved by about 1.5 in the active comparator arm versus a decline of 0.85 in the placebo. So the difference of 2.4 was considered statistically significant. The clinical significance of this change is unclear. If you would like to look at additional details about this study, they're on table 4 and page 114. I will point out the secondary endpoints that they looked at did not reach statistical significance. We could go to the next slide, please.
I have one comment on that. One of the secondary endpoints was the perception of change by both the physician and the clinician and the patient. And this is a very simple scale where it's, are you the same, better, or worse? And a little bit or a lot. And neither the prescribers nor the patients noticed any clinical difference.
Thank you for pointing that out.
So
And,
that
they use the a statistical analysis where if they didn't meet significance on one, they didn't do the analysis for the rest. I did include those other secondary endpoints in the table for the sake of completeness. They did show the activities of daily living. There was an improvement in that, but you're right, on those other scales that they use for the secondary endpoints, there was not statistical significance. So thank you for pointing that out. I thought you might have something to say about the quality of this study.
Don't I usually?
Yes, you do. We could go on to trial limitations. So as I pointed out, this was a small sample size, which is not surprising because it is a rare disease. But I did want to point out the full analysis population was limited to those 82 patients that had pes cavus. And then you might notice that there were a lot of adverse effects that were observed with the active comparator. And so that might have resulted in unblinding of patients and investigators. Attrition was higher, it was 14% in the active treatment arm, and the attrition was mostly due to adverse effects and withdrawal from the study. I think the attrition in the placebo arm was only 4%. This was a modest trial duration, 48 weeks for a lifelong progressive disease. I will say more data is needed so we can assess what the sustainability and neurologic improvement would be. An open label extension trial was part of the MOXIe trial that was conducted over 3 years in a small cohort of patients that progressed out of the second part of the trial. Because of, most of those patients were ambulatory, so we don't know if we can generalize these results to patients that might be wheelchair bound that have more severe Friedreich's ataxia. And the other thing, people under 16 years of age were excluded. And as this condition is generally diagnosed in children and adolescents, the safety and efficacy in this population are important. We could go to the next slide, please. So the most common adverse effects observed in the phase 1 and phase 2 portion of this trial were transient increases in ALT and AST, and then headache, nausea, abdominal pain, fatigue, diarrhea, and musculoskeletal pain. When the drug was discontinued, the ALT and AST did return to normal values within 4 weeks. No cases of sustained hepatic injury were reported during the study. Of note as well, in part 2 of the MOXIe trial, some patients had increases in BNP above the upper limit of normal. 14% of those in the active comparator arm had increased BNP compared to 4% in the placebo-treated arm. So if you look at page 117, there's a snippet of the prescribing information. So based on what they saw in this trial, the manufacturer does recommend obtaining ALT, AST, bilirubin, BNP, and then lipid parameters due to the impact on cholesterol metabolism prior to starting treatment with omaveloxolone, and then periodically during treatment. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about the proposed PA criteria that we put together. The first thing I wanted to point out is I included this table. This drug is contraindicated in patients that have severe hepatic impairment, and it is metabolized through CYP3A4. As we know, that is a well-known pathway for drug interactions. So if people are on strong inhibitors, it's recommended to avoid, but avoid using it with another drug like that. If not, the dose should be reduced. Same thing if it's a moderate inhibitor, the dose should be reduced. If it's a strong or moderate inducer, then it's recommended to avoid concomitant use. So if we can go to the next slide. The proposed PA criteria are on page 118 of the packet. So basically, we just want to make sure it's being used for an FDA-approved indication in a patient that's 16 years of older. If they've already received this therapy, we'll go to the renewal criteria, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So we want to make sure that the baseline labs have been obtained prior to starting therapy. If the baseline BNP is higher than 200, that's a contraindication, so we would not approve it. If they have severe hepatic impairment, that's also a contraindication, so it would not be approved. they have moderate liver impairment, we would want to make sure the dose has been modified. And then finally, the last assessment is, are they taking any other drugs that might have a serious drug interaction with omaveloxolone in the table I just talked about. And then the next slide is the renewal criteria. And we would just ask that if it comes up for renewal, that the prescriber attests that the patient is improving with this therapy, and if so, we would approve it for 12 months. So with that, I will open it to any questions or comments from the committee.
Bill.
Yeah, this is like many of these new drugs that had an accelerated approval. It's a very select population of the disease and a very minimal amount of improvement. It's a horrible disease, and I'm not sure this makes any difference long term. And there's a lot of toxicity to it. I think, of course, we have to have an access to it because it's FDA approved, but I think we should have our criteria parallel the population that was studied. There's no evidence that this works in people with severe disease, and there will be a strong temptation to try this in people with severe disease because that's the normal tendency in people with horrible diseases. We want to try and help them, whether it works or not. I don't know what the cost is, but there's a safe bet it's astronomical. So I think we need to limit it to the population that was studied, and that would be people that are basically ambulatory, can swallow. And I don't know what to do about the Pescavus situation. Because these people were excluded because they couldn't undergo the testing.
They were excluded from the full analysis, correct?
Yeah. And so I don't know if it's more or less effective in those folks, but I think we have to keep it to what's been proven so far. And if further evidence shows that it works better than this, then of course we'll expand it. But I think we have to start out tight, as we have done with many of these other high-cost drugs with limited benefit, even though it's a horrible disease.
So what I hear you say is maybe we should ask two more questions. Ask if they're ambulatory and ask if they can swallow.
Yes.
Okay, I think that would be easy enough to add. I don't believe the mFARS score is used routinely in practice. I think it was more used for the trial. So I think it would be difficult to ask for an assessment of that scale, because it was limited to people between 20 and 80 in the clinical trial. But I think those two things that you suggested would be easy to add if the rest of the committee agrees.
And before we get into that point, we do have public comments. So I want to entertain more questions or comments from the committee before we entertain that, but we can come back to that recommendation, Bill. Doug, yes, you unmuted. Do you have a question or comment?
I fully support Bill's recommendations, and it's an easy descriptor. It's nothing arcane about it. It fits the description. You know, I think a couple of months ago, just a side comment, when it comes to NCCN guidelines, we look at the original, you know, the position of or group of study that led to the approval of those descriptors. Often what happens is it's expanded to an entire much larger group that really has no proven benefit, but they're add-ons. And often it's actually the 80-20 rule. They prove it in 20%, and then they add in the 80% and call it a day. And so just saying.
Thank you, Doug. Any other comments, questions? We do have Robert Jaramillo of PharmD He is a representative of, he's conflict of interest. He represents the manufacturer, Reata Pharma. I've made you a co-host. Are you able to unmute your line?
Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you loud and clear.
Right. Well, I'll go ahead and have a couple comments. We had prepared and a couple comments to some of the statements that you made. So, well,
Just to clarify, you have 3 minutes. I have a timer. I'm trying to get it up on my screen, but I'm going to start
Sure.
it as soon as you start. Go ahead with your prepared comments, and then we'll leave time for questions and answers from the committee after that, and it won't be a subject to your time, but you can use your time for your prepared comments and address anything you want at that point, and then we'll stop that and defer to the committee to see if they have any future or further comments or questions of you. So with that, the floor is yours.
Well, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Robert Jaramillo, and I am a medical outcomes and value liaison at Reata Pharmaceuticals. And today I will be talking about omaveloxolone, a brand name Skyclarys, the first and only FDA-approved therapy indicated for the treatment of Friedreich's ataxia in adults and adolescents aged 16 years of age of older. We recognize and appreciate your decision to recommend prior authorization for Skyclarys, but wanted to use our time today to address your criteria to help you achieve your goal of promoting use that is consistent with medical evidence and product labeling in patients with Friedreich's ataxia. First, we wanted to comment on your question of asking if FA patients are taking cytochrome P3A4 inhibitors and inducers. Your question appropriately ensures that the dose of Skyclarys has been adjusted, but would appreciate your consideration for the approval period to be in line with your overall recommendation of 12 months rather than a 6-month interval, seeing that the dosing recommendations have been accommodated and a 12-month approval will be in alignment with the 1-year treatment period of the pivotal study. We also wanted to comment on your renewal criteria of ensuring that the prescriber provides a provider attests to patient improvement. It's important to mention that Friedreich's ataxia is a progressive disease. Unfortunately, these patients will continue to lose neurological function, ambulation, upper limb movement, throughout their disease. And seeing that Skyclarys has shown it slows disease progression over 48 weeks compared to placebo and slows progression compared to a matched untreated population in our 3-year propensity matched analysis, we suggest in addition to improvement, maintenance of their neurological function or have experienced less progression could be considered, seeing that Friedreich's ataxia is a progressive disease and maintaining or slowing the decline in the quality of life is important to these patients. I also wanted to quickly just mention that we do have data showing that the capsule can be opened and be put into applesauce, so I can provide that to you. Also, you mentioned Pes/Cavus. Keep in mind, our primary endpoint was focusing in on that full analysis set, but we do have data in the all randomized population, which did include patients with Pes/Cavus, and we did see a statistical significant in the overall population. And the last is ambulatory. I do want to keep in mind that even after patients, are wheelchair bound, they're still progressing in their disease, in particular loss of upper limb, the ability to speak, so they still are progressing in their disease. So in closing, Skyclarys is the first and only disease-specific therapy approved by the FDA for the treatment of Friedreich's ataxia. And omaveloxolone may help address some of the unmet needs seen in patients with Friedreich's ataxia by slowing the worsening of progressive disease in treated patients compared to placebo population. And I respectfully request, that you consider these policy comments and achieve, your goal of promoting use that's consistent with medical evidence and product labeling in patients with the Friedreich's ataxia. So I'll stop there, and thank you for your time and attention, and happy to address any questions.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. So turn your attention back to the screen. Deanna, if you want to reiterate the recommendations and bring up the criteria for some of that discussion.
Sure. So the recommendation is to maintain omaveloxolone as non-preferred on the PMPDP with clinical PA criteria to ensure medically appropriate use. I would open it up to the committee to see if there's any other adjustments to the PA criteria beyond requiring it in ambulatory patients and able to swallow, based on the feedback you got from the manufacturer. Or if anybody wants to make a motion to modify the PA criteria.
I have one comment that will surprise you all. The idea of requiring improvement in a progressive disease is probably unrealistic. I would modify that to say that the patient has, in the prescribing physician's judgment, has had little or no deterioration, or perhaps, well, I don't know how to say that. But if it stabilizes someone and they don't deteriorate, that is a success. And expecting improvement is probably unrealistic.
I think that's reasonable. I think that's similar to what we did with the SMA PA criteria. We finally landed on some language that said that they're stable.
Yeah.
Right, or like delayed progression or something like that.
I think that's reasonable.
I can look at the SMA PA criteria and kind of use that language because it's a similar disease and that it's slowly progressing. And so it is difficult to assess.
So like slows expected progression.
That sounds good.
Other
Yeah,
questions or comments?
Yeah.
Sorry, Deanna.
No, I was just going to say, so to summarize, Bill's motion is to add that they're ambulatory and able to swallow to the PA criteria, and then add to the renewal criteria that the expected progression has slowed or that they've stabilized. I just wanted to confirm that was what his motion was.
That's correct.
Other suggestions?
Other comments or recommendations? If not, we need a motion to approve the proposed PA criteria as amended.
So moved.
Second.
Doug. Thanks, Tim.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Abstain? All right, motion carries as amended. And Deanna, you got all that?
I did, and I'm sure if I didn't, that Roger did, but thank you.
Awesome. All right, thank you.
Great. Next up, we have, starting on page 121 in the packet of materials, the CGRP inhibitor DERP summary, and we'll turn it over to Dave.
Hi, thank you, Roger. Yeah, so the purpose of this class update is to include new evidence from a recently published DERP summary report. If you go to the next page, general overview, we're going to talk just a little bit about zavegepant. That's the newest approved drug for acute migraine treatment. Presently, 2 of these agents are preferred, but all must meet clinical PA criteria. Our clinical current PA criteria for this class requires documentation of at least 4 migraines per month, failure of an FDA-approved migraine prophylactic therapy, and beta blockers, anticonvulsants, tricyclic antidepressants, and specialist consult in order to get approval. Appears there are approximately 100 fee-for-service claims for CGRP inhibitors in the previous quarter, so quarter 1, 2023. Next slide, please. So here we can see the current FDA-approved CGRP inhibitors, some of the general dosing and their approval dates and indications, and then the associated trials included in this review. Most of the monoclonal antibodies, or the MABs, are generally approved for migraine prevention and are usually administered once monthly or even once every 3 months, depending on the agent. Alternatively, many of the small molecule CGRP inhibitors, known as gepants, they're used for acute migraine treatment and taken orally. There's a few exceptions. Rimegepant, it's indicated for migraine prevention and acute treatment. And atogepant is indicated only for migraine prevention. Zavegepant is not yet commercially available. So go to the next slide, look at the evidence. So as far as the evidence contained in the DERP report, this table is organized by indication, the drugs that were studied for that indication, comparator, which in most cases was placebo, and the outcomes studied. Results, they're consolidated whenever possible and reported as a range along with the timing of the assessment and the evidence quality rating. Mostly, we'll look at these agents that have moderate or higher quality evidence. However, there's some of those newer agents covered in the report that were graded as having only low quality evidence available. There's more detail in the packet, but once again, I'll just hit the highlights. So you can see here, for the prevention of chronic migraine, that means those with 15 or more headaches per month, treatment with eptinezumab, erenumab, fremanezumab, and galcanezumab over 12 weeks resulted in roughly 2 to 3 fewer migraine days per month compared to placebo. This was based on moderate quality evidence. And then the second grouping there, see for those being treated with CGRP inhibitors for episodic migraines, that's less than 15 headache days per month. We'll see there's moderate quality evidence that atogepant, eptinezumab, erenumab, fremanezumab, and galcanezumab resulted in anywhere from 0.4 to 3 fewer migraine days per month compared to placebo. This is over 12 weeks and also had moderate quality of evidence. And then lastly, it was reported that in mixed populations having a chronic or episodic migraine, it was reported that eptinezumab, erenumab, fremanezumab, galcanezumab, and rimegepant resulted in anywhere from almost 1 to roughly 4 fewer migraine days per month compared to placebo. And this was over 12 to 24 weeks and moderate quality evidence. Let's look at the next slide, please. And here we see the evidence for acute migraine treatment. These are the more rapid acting small molecule CGRP inhibitors, or the GPENs. There was moderate quality evidence that rimegepant and abrogepant had 7 to 17% or higher percentage of participants with freedom from pain within 2 hours of treatment. And there was roughly 7% more patients experiencing freedom from pain within 2 hours compared to placebo on those using zavegepant 10 and 20 milligrams. But this was based on low quality evidence. And there was low quality evidence that galcanezumab was better than placebo in preventing cluster headache, resulting in about 2 to 3 fewer attacks per week in the short term. That's weeks 1 through 3, but only about 1 less attack per week compared to placebo at 8 to 12 weeks. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview. There was low to moderate quality of evidence that certain CGRP inhibitors had positive effects in various functional improvement outcomes compared to placebo. So we see the HIT6, the MIDAS, and the MSQL listed there. In general, there's a lot of factors that could influence the interpretation for clinical significance and functional improvement. For instance, it was reported that the HIT6 instrument was used in studies with eptinezumab, erenumab, and fremanezumab. Reported a clinically significant difference between groups is 1.5 points. And as pointed out in the report, 15 of the 17 studies with these agents, there's a between group difference of 1.9 points or more for the active drug compared with placebo, which suggests a clinically important improvement on this measure. However, some of these positive outcomes are based on low quality of evidence, meaning the reviewers had little confidence in the estimate of effect due to serious study limitations. Keeping that in mind. The next slide, please. So few of the studies reported findings by subgroups. So there's insufficient evidence for the use of CGRP inhibitors in different subgroups. And evidence was also insufficient to assess benefit beyond 24 weeks or between CGRP inhibitors alone or in combination with other agents. Next slide for safety. Adverse events such as constipation, injection site pain, infection, and those types of things, as well as severe adverse events and discontinuations due to adverse events. They're rare and similar to placebo for the majority of the CGRP inhibitors. So a relationship cannot be determined according to the report. Many of the studies only evaluated treatment on one or few attacks, so they couldn't really capture harms data very effectively, so that was limited. Speaking of limitations, so next slide, there are a number of them as mentioned, including manufacturer sponsorship and extensive involvement in the trials. There were no head-to-head trials that directly compared CGRP inhibitors. As mentioned, many of the trials were short duration, so 12 weeks. So long-term evidence for efficacy and harms with long-term therapy is unknown. Only studies of single acute migraine attacks were assessed. So once again, effectiveness and safety of repeated use is generally unknown. Patients who are pregnant or those who had clinically significant psychiatric or medical conditions were excluded. So the effects in a less selective study population is unknown. And many of the studies include mostly females, so that's a limitation as well. Wanted to point out some changes to the PA criteria on the next slide. So we added in zavegepant for acute migraine treatment. So that is on there now, although once again, it's not commercially available yet. But the next slide, we modified a statement in our criteria to align more with HERC guidance for the treatment of migraine headaches. Not sure, but Kathy may be discussing that a little more in her presentation a little bit later. But basically, the HERC doesn't specify that prerequisite agents need to be from different classes, only that the patient has not responded to at least 3 agents. So we changed our wording a bit. Criteria is to require treatment failure of at least 1 agent from each of those classes, but we modified it to read, has the patient had an adequate trial 2 to 6 months without response or has contraindications to at least 3 of the following preferred drugs, and then we list propranolol immediate release, metoprolol or atenolol, topiramate, valproic acid, Divalprex, amitriptyline, nortriptyline, or venlafaxine. So basically 3 out of that group. And you can see that the wording hasn't changed. Do they have the patient have an intolerance or contraindication, that type of thing, that would exclude that as well. So that was really the only change to the PA criteria. So therefore our recommendations after clinical review, we recommend no changes to the preferred drug list at this time, and we'd like to evaluate costs in executive session. With that, if there are any questions.
Any questions for Dave? We do have two representatives from industry that would like to provide public comment. We'll call them in a moment, but we'll open it up to questions for Dave first. Or comments. Okay, hearing none. We have David Goss, representative Pfizer. Are you able to unmute your line?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Hear you loud and clear.
Great.
Same goes for you. We'll give you 3 minutes for your prepared comments, and then if the committee has any questions, they can ask that after your time expires. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As Roger said, my name is Dave Gross, and I'm with Pfizer Medical Affairs. I'm joining today to provide information on Nurtec ODT. Nurtec is indicated for acute treatment of migraine with or without aura in adults, and for preventative treatment of episodic migraine in adults. For the acute treatment of migraine, the recommended dose is 75 milligrams taken orally as needed, and the maximum dose in a 24-hour period is 75 milligrams. The safety of using more than 18 doses in a 30-day period has not been established. For preventative treatment of episodic migraine, the recommended dose is 75 milligrams orally every other day. The efficacy of Nurtec for acute treatment of migraine in adults was demonstrated in a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Patients in the study were randomized to receive 75 milligrams of Nurtec or placebo. Primary outcome variables were measured pain freedom and most bothersome symptom freedom at 2 hours after dosing compared to placebo. The percentage of patients achieving headache pain freedom and most bothersome symptom freedom 2 hours after a single dose was statistically significantly greater in patients who received Nurtec. And statistically significant effects of Nurtec compared to placebo were demonstrated for additional efficacy endpoints of pain relief at 2 hours, sustained pain freedom 2 to 48 hours, use of rescue medications within 24 hours, and the percentage of patients reporting normal function at 2 hours. It was well tolerated. The most common adverse reaction in the study was nausea, which occurred in 2% of the patients receiving Nurtec compared to 0.4% of the patients with the placebo. The efficacy of Nurtec ODT for the preventative treatment of episodic migraines in adults was also studied in a similar type study. Patients were randomized to receive every other day dosing of Nurtec, 75 milligrams or placebo for 12 weeks. Primary efficacy endpoint was a change from baseline in the mean number of monthly migraine days during weeks 9 through 12. Percentage of patients who achieved at least a 50% reduction from baseline in moderate to severe monthly migraine days between 9 and 12 weeks was also evaluated. Nurtec 75 milligrams dosed every other day demonstrated statistically significant improvements for these efficacy endpoints compared to placebo. Again, the most common adverse events were nausea and additionally abdominal pain or dyspepsia. It's contraindicated in patients with a history of hypersensitivity reaction to rimegepant. And my time is nearly up, so I'd like to thank you for your time and consideration and respectfully request that you consider placing Nurtec on the preferred drug list. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Any questions for David? All right, appreciate that. We also have Rochelle Yang, representative of Teva. Rochelle, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I can. Thank you. All right. Hi, my name is Rochelle Yang. I'm a pharmacist with Medical Affairs at Teva. Thank you for that comprehensive CGRP clinical review. So I'll just keep this brief. So just as a quick reminder, Ajovy or fremonizumab is a monoclonal antibody which binds to the CGRP ligand and blocks its binding to the receptor. It's a self-administered subcutaneous CGRP inhibitor and the only one of which that's approved for both monthly and quarterly dosing for the prevention of migraine. So in addition to the phase 3 HALO and FOCUS trials, which were included in the evaluation, we have several different real world evidence studies that have been published recently where Ajovy has been associated with sustained reduction in monthly migraine days by an average of 9 days from a mean baseline of 12.7 days at 6 months post initiation of therapy. We've also seen high adherence and persistence in the real world data with 3/4 of patients in a recent claims review study who were found to be adherent to therapy. Jovi has also been associated with decreased claims for acute medications, including opioids and triptans, and has been found to be effective in migraine prevention for patients with comorbid depression and anxiety, which are common comorbidities of migraine. I will note there are important limitations with these retrospective observational studies, and they do not prove causality. However, the real world evidence to date is consistent with what we've seen in the phase 3 randomized controlled trials and provides an important addition to the large body of evidence supporting AJOVY for migraine prevention. I would like to thank the committee for allowing Oregon Medicaid patients to have continued access to AJOVY. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle. Any questions from the committee? Hearing none, I just received a message that Aaron Nowak from AbbVie would also like to provide public comment. Give me a second. I'm trying to find you in my slate of. There we go. Okay, Aaron, you caught me. Lucky I saw the chat message because you hadn't signed up in advance, but nonetheless, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yep, and I'll check with you after this. I thought I had sent it to the right inbox, but I'll double check that I have that for next time. So thanks so much, Roger.
No worries. I might have missed it.
So hi, committee. My name is Erin Novak, and I am a medical outcome science liaison for AbbVie. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today regarding atogepant, brand name Qulipta. And atogepant is a calcitonin gene-related peptide or CGRP receptor antagonist indicated for the preventive treatment of migraine in adults, now covering both episodic and chronic migraine. The recommended dose is 10, 30, or 60 milligrams orally once daily for episodic migraine. And most recently, atogepant 60 milligrams once daily was approved for chronic migraine. And dose modifications may be recommended for drug interactions and special populations as listed in the prescribing information. Following oral administration, atogepant is absorbed with a peak plasma concentration at approximately 1 to 2 hours and has a half-life of approximately 11 hours. This affords the suitability for daily dosing as well as fast clearance of the drug in approximately 3 days, shall a patient need to withdraw therapy for any reason. And atogepant was evaluated in 2 12-week phase 3 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trials, and the primary endpoint of change from baseline in mean monthly migraine days across 12 weeks compared to placebo was met for both episodic and chronic migraine. And the benefits of atogepant were evident as early as the first full day after administration. Atogepant uniquely met all 6 key secondary endpoints compared to placebo for the 30 and 60 milligram doses for episodic migraine and 60 milligrams for chronic migraine. And this included 3 patient-reported outcomes. Additionally, social and work-related activity functions were significantly improved, acute medication use was reduced, and monthly headache days and 50% responder rates were improved. 55 to 60% of patients in episodic migraine and 41% of patients in chronic migraine were able to reduce their monthly migraine days by half or better over the 12-week trial periods. Outcomes data have demonstrated that atogepant has the lowest number needed to treat when compared to all approved CGRP gepants and monoclonal antibodies used for the prevention of episodic migraine when looking at the 50% responder rates, potentially resulting in cost savings. As for safety, there is 1 contraindication and warning of hypersensitivity in the prescribing information. The most frequently reported adverse events in the phase 3 trials were constipation, nausea, and fatigue, and discontinuation rates were low in the clinical trials. And as the only oral CGRP therapy with a broad indication of migraine prevention, I respectfully request that atogepant be available for persons with episodic and chronic migraine, and also for providers on the Oregon PDL, and for the prior authorization to be updated with chronic migraine. So thank you for your time, and I can take any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Any questions for Aaron? All right. We'll put the recommendations back up. Great, you've amended this because Dave did present a proposal to update the PA criteria. Otherwise, no clinical or no changes are recommended to the PDL based on the clinical information, but we are proposing that we review cost in executive session. Any questions, or we'll entertain a motion?
Just an observation, and maybe
Yeah,
a
please.
clarification, Roger. When I look at this, it looks like this entire group is considered a prophylaxis group, and therefore the criteria are amended to that. You know, there is rimegepant is kind of an odd thing. I think from a practical point of view, as a physician, if someone was taking it, you could say, you know, you're taking it every other day, but if you get a migraine, I guess you could take an extra one when that happens. But it's still, the basis is still the prophylaxis. And I would imagine that triptans and other interventions for acute would be on top of these drugs. So I think that there's no carve out or particular consideration for that that particular drug within the schema. I guess that's an observation and a question at the same time.
Dave or Sarah?
Yeah, I was just trying to bring up the full criteria. Give me 1 second. And I know Dave only presented the changes, but there are like 2 diverging pathways in this criteria, one for prevention and one for treatment. And so,
Well, there is.
Yeah, the step therapy that Dave presented was prevention, but if you look further in the criteria, we do have some consideration for treatment. I don't know, Dave, if you want to add anything else, or if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, we could go through the criteria, but yeah, as Sarah pointed out, there is a pathway there. So
At what number was that then?
I believe at number so number 6 starts to talk about abortive
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
All right.
And then various questions will get you on a different pathway depending on how those are answered.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I just didn't see now the question is yeah. So the changing to the trial of 3 drugs versus the 3 drug classes, your interpretation of what the HERC suggests, is that?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Well, what's the evidence for changing to trial 3 drugs versus drug classes?
Oh, yeah. Well, this was more of a response to try to more somewhat align our criteria with what the HERC has under their guideline notes and whatnot for the treatment of migraines. So,
well, and I mean, it's logical from a practitioner's point of view that you know that you try at least one from 3 of the classes that are known to have some effect.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's more logic and practical use than any particular evidence. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hey, Dave, I had one quick question on this. So in addition to the PA, so when we approve a PA, is there quantity limits in place or not?
I believe so. I would have to check with Sarah on the coding.
I just wonder because again, if they're using these both for preventive and abortive therapy, then, and there's some data for the maximum number of doses per month. It's not like, it's more just a question. I don't have a suggestion to do that at this point. It was just, I wondered if that was part of the PA process.
Yeah, I can check on that. I believe there are some built-in quantity limits, but I don't know if Sarah, if you have that information handy or not.
Yeah, I can answer kind of generally. So this approval, well, at least initial approval is for up to 3 months. And so when we load that criteria, we load enough units to last them 3 months. And so if they run out early, that is a consideration, or it can be a consideration on renewal. If they're requesting that renewal of the PA criteria early, that's one way we can catch, if they're using it for both prevention and prophylaxis.
Okay.
And that PA request that comes in from the prescriber would have the number of units that they're wishing to prescribe that should account for that. So if it is for both, the sufficient number of units should be loaded for that period of time.
Got it. All right. Hey, thank you, guys.
Other questions? Okay, so again, the recommendations in front of the committee are to amend the PA criteria as proposed. No changes to the PDL based on the clinical information, and to evaluate costs in executive session. Do we have a motion?
Move to approve, Origer.
A second?
Second.
Thanks, Eddie.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? All right, thank you.
We did have one request from the chair. If we could do one more class before we go to break, that would align better with one quick need to step out. So take your attention to page 141 in the packet. And Deanna, put you on the spot. We'll start with the severe inflammatory skin disease.
All right, thank you, Roger. Yeah, if you want to look at page 141, I didn't put slides together for this. Basically, this is just a prior authorization criteria update. What we wanted to do was align the PA criteria for atopic dermatitis, which is in the middle of the TIMS for asthma and AD, as well as the TIMS for autoimmune conditions. So the reason we're doing this is the HERC, the Health Evidence Review Commission, revised guideline note 21 earlier this year. They did that in February. And it was based on discussions that we had had back and forth. So prior to this, the HERC guidance had pimecrolimus included as one of the topical calcineurin inhibitors that could be tried for severe atopic dermatitis. And we realized that pimecrolimus is only approved for mild atopic dermatitis, mild to moderate, or I think mild. And then crisaborole, a PDE4 inhibitor, was also listed in the HERC guidance, and crisaborole or Eucrisa is only approved for mild atopic dermatitis. So basically, HERC revised the suggestions to be a 4-week trial of a combination of a topical moderate to high potency steroid in combination with a topical calcineurin inhibitor like tacrolimus. They didn't have the in combination part in there, or an oral modulator. So what we did was modify our PA criteria. If you could scroll down to page 148, Sarah. Very quick. All right. So this is where we changed the guidance. So you can see we took out pimecrolimus, which is what we had in there before, as well as the crisaborole or the PDE4 inhibitor. So the revised criteria basically it is aligned with the HERC guidance. And then we added the 4-week trial, and then just made sure that the immunomodulators were the ones that had been used for atopic dermatitis, including the oral corticosteroids. And then if you could go to page, I want to say we have one more clerical change. What page was that on? Page.
We've got like similar updates on 157 in the
Right,
packet.
and the page before that, 156, I think we accepted the change for number 7. So we just made sure that we quantified the length of treatment. It used to just say approved for length of treatment, and we added or up to 1 year, whichever is longer. So that was the other change, and I think the change was accepted, so that's why it's not in red. But yeah, and then, so this is the other set of PA criteria. This is the TIMS for autoimmune diseases. So on the next page is where we modified the language to reflect the HERC guidance. So that's the proposal, just basically to revise the PA criteria for those 2 sets of atopic dermatitis criteria to require a 4-week trial and failure or contraindication of topical steroids in combination with a topical calcineurin inhibitor or an oral immunomodulator prior to approval. So we have dupilumab, upadacitinib, and then abrocitinib is also approved for atopic dermatitis, and that's not specifically called out in the HERC guidance, but if you follow the PA criteria for any of the drugs for atopic dermatitis, they'll follow that same pathway. So any questions or comments about those changes?
As always, Deanna, I'm always impressed at how well you pronounce these medications.
Oh, I think Dave gets the award today for doing the CGRPs.
Oh yeah, no. Dave did a great job too.
Yeah, I was not jealous that he had that class of drugs to review today. But thank you, Stacy.
Any other questions or comments for Deanna?
So we just have if there's no comments, just a motion to approve that recommendation would be appreciated.
Move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Abstain? All right, thank you.
So Stacy, I know you need to take a break. We have a break scheduled. I think the next topic is going to take too long and you'd have to step away. So I'm going to propose we go on break now for 15 minutes. I'll start the timer. We'll be back shortly after probably 3:30 to begin. If you're still out for a few more minutes, Bill Orger has kindly offered to step in and be the chair for a few minutes, but I would assume you'll be back shortly so you can participate in the conversation for the next subject. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we will have 15-minute break. So we'll see you back here in 15 minutes, everyone. Thank you. Okay. Welcome back. We'll pick up where we left off. We have 2 more topics. So I'll draw your attention to page 162 in the packet of materials and turn it back over to Kathy.
Thanks, Roger. So today we'll be talking about botulinum toxins. The purpose of this review is to evaluate the literature for new high-quality evidence for the use of these treatments, as well as to provide an approval route for unfunded conditions that will be covered under the Early and Periodic Screening, Diagnostic, and Treatment Program, known as the EPSDT program, which, just as a reminder, it's a program that allows for treatment of some conditions for those under 21 years of age who are enrolled in Medicaid, which are not normally covered under the OHP fee-for-service program. You can see listed there that there's 6 different types of botulinum agents. 5 of these are the toxin A serotype, and then there's 1 toxin B serotype. These are FDA approved for a variety of different conditions, which we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide. You can see here, go ahead and switch to that slide if you don't mind. In the background, that there are 8 different FDA indications in which botulinum toxins are approved for, as well as they're used for a variety of off-label uses. However, they are restricted to funded diagnosis as outlined in the Oregon Health Plan prioritized list of health services. So if we look here at the first 6 conditions, blepharospasms, cervical dystonias, migraine headaches, overactive bladder, and spasticity, these are all funded diagnoses. Not funded is sialorrhea, and then not covered is the cosmetic indication of a reduction in moderate to severe glabellar lines. So then moving on to the evidence and looking at the reviews, there are actually 11 new systematic reviews identified. Table 2 on page 167 in your handout has all the different outcome assessments for these conditions and a more detailed description of the outcomes, as well as, and then of course your packet has a lot of more detail of the systematic reviews. So we'll just go over these briefly. You can see there on line 1, there are 2 different systematic reviews that looked at bladder conditions and found that Botox serotype A decreased urinary incontinence in women, as well as improved urgency symptoms in adults, all based on high quality evidence from AHRQ and CADITH. Botulinum toxin B decreased sialorrhea in adults with motor neuron disease based on moderate quality evidence. And incobotulinum toxin was more effective than placebo for the treatment of sialorrhea associated with neurologic disorders based on salivary flow in adults based on low quality evidence. One of the issues we do have with this outcome is that there is not a validated outcome for salivary flow. So it's all kind of a little bit more subjective. For the next review, Cochrane review, there was moderate evidence in children that botulinum toxin A reduced lower limb spasticity related to cerebral palsy compared to placebo. A Cochrane review also found moderate evidence in adult that botulinum toxin A was more effective in reducing symptoms of cervical dystonia compared to placebo. Moving on, a couple more systematic reviews. First one, Cochrane found moderate quality evidence that a one-time injection of botulinum toxin A was more effective than placebo in reducing the severity of blepharospasms. And then lastly, a Cochrane review found high quality evidence in adult that botulinum toxin A was effective for the treatment of chronic migraines and reducing the number of migraine headache days per month. It was on average about a reduction of 1.9 days. Then there's 3 additional systematic reviews that found indications that lack conclusive evidence of benefit. The first one was in children with idiopathic toe walking, in which there's only very low quality evidence that botulinum toxin A improved this condition compared to standard of care, which was serial casting. The second review looked at botulinum toxin A to reduce the symptoms of cervical dystonias when compared to trihexylphenidol, and found that botulinum toxin was superior to this, but again, very low quality evidence. And then the last review done by CADITH found very low quality evidence that botulinum toxin A was effective in reducing symptoms of pelvic pain in adult women. Moving on to guidelines, we did find 2 different high quality guidelines, both by NICE. One which recommends the use of botulinum toxin A for the management of overactive bladder in women with urinary incontinence and pelvic prolapse who have not responded to other pharmacotherapy. And then the second guideline was an evidence review, or guideline recommendation was an evidence review that found very low quality evidence that botulinum toxin A was more effective than placebo for elucidating a positive response when used for spasticity in people with MS. And so their recommendation is that it should only be used by a specialist due to the lack of high quality data. There were 7 different randomized clinical trials that start on page 178 of your packet that looked at botulinum toxins. The first one looked at onabotulism toxin A in children ages 5 to 17 years with a neurogenic detrusor, overactivity, and urinary incontinence. And they looked at 3 different doses of onabotulinum toxin. Basically, the 50-unit dose was served as a control because this, again, was done in a pediatric population. And they did find the same reduction in number of urinary incontinent episodes, which was the primary outcome at 6 weeks for all the doses. So a decrease in 1.3 episodes per day. And so the conclusion was that it was effective in the treatment of NDO in pediatric patients. The next 2 studies, we're not going to go into a lot of detail on because these are with daxibotulinum toxin, which is only indicated for the cosmetic use of reduction of glabellar lines, which is not covered as we had already discussed, but it did find that it was more effective than placebo in both of those studies. Moving on to the next slide. These studies are both done in children. The first one looked at botulinum toxin in children ages 2 to 17 years with unilateral or bilateral spastic cerebral palsy and an Ashworth scale score of 2. So the Ashworth scale ranges from 0 to 4. So a 2 is about moderate rigidity, and is looking at the effectiveness for upper limb spasticity. And at week 4, they did find that the high dose of 8 units per kilogram was superior to the control, which they used 2 units per kilogram. The p-value there is actually, it's incorrect. It's 0.017. So it was found to be superior to the lower dose statistically and also clinically significantly improved spasticity in the upper limbs. The second trial there on abobotulism toxin in children, again, 2 to 17 years with a modified Ashworth score of 2 and or a gross motor function classification score of 1 to 4, found that abobotulism toxin was also effective in reducing upper limb spasticity associated with cerebral palsy, that again was statistically significant and then also clinically significant at week 6. Looking at a couple more studies, these last 2 studies looked at the use of incobotulinum toxin. The first one was in children, ages again 2 to 17 with lower limb spasticity, either unilateral or bilateral related to cerebral palsy. And this study did find at 4 weeks that it was clinically significantly, more significantly improves statistical and clinical significance over placebo or over the low dose group for spasticity. And then the second trial in adults looked at adult patients with chronic sialorrhea, either due to Parkinson's disease, atypical Parkinsonism, stroke, or traumatic brain injury. And this looked at the unstimulated salivary flow rate at baseline and did find that it did reduce salivary flow. Again, the clinical significance of that is unknown, but compared to placebo, it was found to be superior. There were also 4 new indications for the different botulinum toxin agents. Abobotulinum toxin in September of 2019 was approved for the treatment of upper limb spasticity in pediatric patients 2 years of age and older. At first, it did exclude spasticity related to cerebral palsy. However, in July of 2020, that exclusion was removed. So currently there are no exclusions related to that condition. Onabotulinum toxin had several different new indications approved. One in June of 2019, it received an indication for the treatment of upper limb spasticity. And then it was also approved for lower limb spasticity, both of these in the pediatric population of 2 to 17 years. Then in February of 2021, it was approved for pediatric neurogenic detrusor overactivity. And then lastly, in July of 2021, it was approved in adults for 8 additional upper limb muscles for upper limb spasticity indications. Rhinobotulism toxin A received a new indication for the treatment of chronic sialorrhea in adults in August of 2019. And then next slide here on incobotulinum toxin A, it was approved for the treatment of chronic sialuria in patients 2 to 17 years in December of 2020. And this followed a previous approval for adults in 2018 for that same indication. In August of 2020, incobotulinum toxin was approved for the treatment of upper limb spasticity in pediatric patients 2 to 17 years of age, excluding the spasticity caused by cerebral palsy. And then lastly, as I alluded to, daxibotulinum toxin A received approval by the FDA in 2022 for the improvement in the appearance of moderate to severe glabellar lines associated with congruent and procerus muscle activity. This product carries similar adverse effects as the other botulinum products, including a boxed warning. And it is not approved for other indications at this time other than cosmetic. So then we will look at the changes to the criteria, which are pretty straightforward. One is just to include coverage, a pathway for coverage for the EPSDT benefit. And then the second is just a couple clarifying changes that I'll highlight. So you can see that first goal there, we updated that to, again, allow a pathway for approval. If you go down to the actual approval criteria, number 1 and 2 are standard wording, referring them either to the renewal criteria, and then the second one is what is the diagnosis being treated. Number 3, we're asking if any of the requests are for the use of botulinum toxin in the treatment of these covered diagnoses, and if they are, then to approve them up to 12 months. Number 4, we're asking here about chronic migraine, and if so, to record baseline headaches per month. Number 5 is asking that this request is being administered or in consultation with a neurologist or headache specialist. Number 6 is what we've already, Dave did a really good job discussing regarding the change or kind of the update to this, in that the patient has an adequate trial of previous trial 2 to 6 months without response or contraindications to at least 3 of the following preferred drugs. And again, this was to align with the HERT guidelines, but also to help facilitate the criteria with the PA desk, just because there was some questions on if the trials had to be in the same or different classes. So that's then an update there. Number 7 just wants to ensure that the headaches are not due to medication overuse, and if they're not, then it is approved. Looking at the next slide, it's asking about the use for basically for overactive bladder. And if yes, again, number 9 has been updated to align with the prioritized list or the HERT guidance that they have tried at least 2 urinary incontinence, antimuscarinic or beta-3 adrenergic therapies, such as those listed there in A through I. And if yes, then it would be approved. Number 10, these are all the different additional conditions that are not covered for those 21 years of age or older. However, you can see there in the purple that we have added some language there that for those less than 21 years of age, that if the condition is of sufficient severity that impacts the patient's health, that it could potentially be approved for that up to 12 months. And so updating the wording there. And then you can see there at the bottom of the slide, I did add sialuria, because in adults, there's not high quality evidence for coverage. So that would be something that would not be funded. And the next slide, this is just a continuation of that number 10, and there's no recommended changes. It's just a list of conditions. And then lastly is the renewal criteria, again, which there's no changes recommended, but the slide is basically asking that the patient has received some benefit from the botulinum toxin for migraine and for overactive bladder. So then the recommendations are to update the PA criteria to allow for coverage for botulinum toxin products under the EPSDT program. Again, for those under 21 in which there is evidence. No changes to the preferred drug list are recommended at this time, and then to evaluate costs in executive session.
Thank you, Kathy. Any questions for Kathy? We do not have any public comment on this topic. Questions or comments on the proposals?
Just a comment, has the same, where I can't imagine that as a practitioner that I would prescribe for someone with migraine, that I would try propranolol, and if that didn't work, I'd try use atenolol, and then I'd ask for an alternative. I mean, usually you try one, at least one from each class before you go on, but whatever. It's doesn't seem very logical to me.
Appreciate the comments, and I hope it's not logical and people do follow the same practice. Other questions or comments or a motion on the recommendations in front of you?
So I move to approve.
Thank you, Doug.
Second.
Second.
Thanks. Thanks,
All
Bill and
those-
Robin.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Anyone opposed? Abstain? All right, thank you.
Great. Next, we will turn it over back to Deanna and draw your attention to page 196 in the packet for the C. diff class update.
All right, thank you, Roger. Yes, and you might notice that what we used to call Clostridium is now called Clostridioides. So this is going to be about C. diff drugs for treatment and prevention. We could go on to the next slide, please. So the purpose for this class update was twofold. First, we wanted to look at any new evidence since our last review in 2018. And then also we wanted to review a newly approved biotherapeutic, Fecal Microbiota Live, Rebiota. It's an enema and it's indicated for the prevention of recurrent CDI in adults. Next slide, please. So since our last P&T review, 2 systematic reviews and 5 guidelines have been published that evaluate the use of fidaxomicin, metronidazole, or vancomycin in treating initial or recurrent CDI. And then the 2 agents we have for prevention of recurrent CDI are bezlotoxumab and then fecal microbiota transplant. Next slide, please. So I organized this in 2 ways, looking at treatment for initial or recurrent CDI and then looking at prevention. So when we look at treatment for initial or recurrent CDI, there was one 22 systematic review that looked at fidaxomicin versus oral vancomycin. And the meta-analysis was a mixed population of patients with an initial CDI or patients that had a recurrent CDI. Moderate quality evidence showed that compared to vancomycin, fidaxomicin was associated with higher global cure rates, which was defined in that systematic review as patients that did not experience a CDI recurrence after clinical cure, which is resolution of diarrhea. In terms of clinical cure rates, resolution of diarrhea following the end of treatment, there was similarity between fidaxomicin and vancomycin. And then finally, fidaxomicin did seem to be associated with lower CDI recurrence rates than vancomycin, and adverse rates were no different between the 2 antibiotics. Next slide, please. So to make this a little bit easier to digest, I made a table at the suggestion of my colleagues, which is always a good idea. So on the left side, you see the American guidance, and on the right side, you see the UK guidance from NICE. So in terms of initial treatment of a CDI in the States, 2 guidance communities, the IDSA SHE group, as well as the American College of Gastroenterology, or ACG, they both recommend oral fidaxomicin as the first-line antibiotic of choice for C. diff. In the UK, for initial treatment of CDI, they still think that oral vancomycin is the first-line antibiotic of choice. That's because fidaxomicin is still very expensive in the UK. It's not cheap here in the States, but the price has come down quite a bit now that we have a generic option. So the NICE guidance is more directed by cost, not necessarily clinical efficacy. There was a network analysis that NICE looked at, which is indirect comparison, that did show that fidaxomicin seemed to be more efficacious than vancomycin, but they haven't come out and advocated fidaxomicin over vancomycin. And then when you go down the treatment guidance on the left-hand side, the American guidance thinks that oral vancomycin is a reasonable alternative to fidaxomicin, depending on what's available in the community. And in the UK, fidaxomicin is recommended second line, especially if vancomycin is ineffective or if there's been treatment failure. Both guidance is in agreement that metronidazole is not first line. It could be used as treatment of last resort. In the UK, it's not recommended at all for treating an initial CDI. I will note that for children, the guidance from 2017 is not changed. So in children, weight-based metronidazole or vancomycin are still the recommendations. All right, let's move to the next slide. Thanks, Sarah. So for treatment or prevention of recurrent CDI, there was a 2020 systematic review that looked at the different interventions for either treatment or prevention. And there was at least one study to support using fidaxomicin for treatment of recurrent CDI. That's when it was compared to a 10-day course of vancomycin. This was low quality evidence. And then we had moderate quality evidence that fecal microbiota transplant compared to 14 days of vancomycin might be more effective in preventing recurrent CDI. Bezlotoxumab, that's the IV drug that's only given one time. We only have comparisons to placebo, the initial trials that brought it to FDA approval. And it is proved to be effective compared to placebo in preventing recurrent CDI. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit more complicated table in terms of treatment or prevention of recurrent CDI. If you look on page 204 in the packet, there's a high level, this is just a high level overview. What the table on page 204 is the IDSA SHEA guidance, and there's a lot more detail about why they decided on what they did. But just to kind of summarize, for treatment of recurrent CDI, fidaxomicin or vancomycin are recommended depending on which antibiotic was given first. In the UK, they use 12 weeks as the cutoff for recurrence. So if another CDI recurs within 12 weeks of the initial infection, then fidaxomicin is recommended. However, if the recurrent infection occurs more than 12 weeks after symptom resolution, either vancomycin or fidaxomicin is recommended. Just for context, IDSA and SHEA consider a recurrent CDI to occur 8 weeks after the initial treatment for the CDI has been completed. In terms of bezlotoxumab, that was new in the 2021 guidance for both IDSA and SHEA, as well as the gastroenterology guidance. They do recommend bezlotoxumab for recurrent CDI within the past 6 months. Bezlotoxumab has to be given along with the standard of care antibiotics, which are fidaxomicin or vancomycin, and it's an infusion, so it's usually given either in the hospital or at a provider's office while they're getting those antibiotics. I wanted to point out that IDSA and SHEA put high value on the potential clinical benefits of bezlotoxumab, but they did note that implementation of using bezlotoxumab might be limited by feasibility because it is an IV drug and it is costly. In settings where administration logistics are not an issue, they went on to say that if it's a primary, the first CDI infection, and the patient has other risk factors, for recurrence of CDI, for example, if they're over 65 years of age, if they're immunocompromised, or if it's a severe infection upon presentation, that those patients might be benefit in particular from bezlotoxumab. Conversely, the NICE guidance from 21 recommends to not offer bezlotoxumab to prevent recurrence because it's not cost effective. As you can tell, NICE does include cost assessments in their guidance. And then finally, I wanted to talk about when is fecal microbiota transplant of use. And all three guidance agree that there should be 3 CDI episodes or the second or more recurrence of CDI before progressing to a fecal microbiota transplant. So that was from the 2021 guidance and the 2022 NICE guidance. Next slide, please. Of note, fidaxomicin did get an expanded indication in 2020 to be able to administered to pediatric patients aged 6 months and older. As of when I did this review, the pediatric guidelines have not changed, but given the fact that fidaxomicin is now approved in pediatrics, I think it might be reasonable if you have a pediatric patient that's had several courses of vancomycin, that perhaps that fidaxomicin might be advantageous in that population. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about the new drugs. So the fecal microbiota enema, or Rebiota. So this is the first FDA approved formulation of any sort of fecal microbiota product. And it's approved to prevent recurrent CDI in adults age 18 and older after they've completed standard of care antibiotic treatment for recurrent CDI. Like bezlotoxumab, it's not indicated for treatment of CDI. It's a live biotherapeutic suspension, 150 mLs. That's a pretty big dose for an enema. And it's approved for one-time rectal administration 24 to 72 hours after the last antibiotic dose. The product is manufactured from human fecal matter that's sourced from qualified donors that have been extensively tested for any transmissible pathogens. The FDA granted breakthrough status, fast track status, and orphan drug designations in November of 22 for this new biotherapeutic. All right, let's move on to the next slide and talk about clinical efficacy. So this was kind of unusual how this drug reached approval. There were 2 trials that were done, the PUNCH CD2 and the PUNCH CD3. The PUNCH CD2 was a phase 2 randomized controlled trial in 133 patients in the modified intention to treat population, which was defined as all participants who successfully completed treatment and were evaluated for the primary endpoint at 8 weeks. For this phase of this study, patients it was adults that had 2 or more recurrent CDI episodes, and their primary outcome was based on getting 2 doses of the fecal microbiota enema 1 week apart. And you can see that they did not achieve statistical significance when they got 2 doses. Interestingly enough, in this trial, they also gave 1 dose of fecal microbiota enema. That was not the primary outcome, but they did see better results when 1 dose was given. So that's why in the PUNCH CD3 phase 3 randomized control trial, they went with 1 dose of the enema. This was a little bit larger, 262 patients were enrolled. It was adults that either had 1 or more episodes of a recurrent CDI after they completed standard of care antibiotics, or if they had 2 or more episodes that resulted in hospitalization, they were all also eligible to be enrolled in the trial. Patients were excluded from both trials if they had inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, celiac disease, continued diarrhea despite antibiotic therapy, or if they had received a previous fecal microbiota transplant. So you'll see in the PUNCH CD3 trial, in the modified intention to treat population, the results for the primary outcome were also not significant. The investigators had found that it was challenging to recruit enough study participants for this trial because of the widespread availability of compounded fecal microbiota products. So they went to the FDA, and in an interim assessment, an agreement was reached that they could use the data from the PUNCH CD2 phase 2 trial in the statistical analysis of the phase 3 trial. So the very bottom line there is the combined statistical analysis when one dose of the fecal microbiota enema was given. And you can see that they had 151 people that had a positive response where they did not have recurrence of the infection versus 72 people in the placebo arm. And so that difference was considered significant with a fairly wide confidence interval of 2.3 to 24. Next slide, please. So some of the trial limitations, in addition to the very interesting statistical analysis they did by recruiting patients from the phase 2 and the phase 3 trial and the statistical analysis, there was a very small number of non-white patients. And as I said, they had excluded patients that had irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, or immunocompromising conditions. So it's difficult to generalize the data from the PUNCH CD3 trial to those populations. There is an open label study going on, which includes a more diverse population compared to the previous studies. And that is allowing patients that are immunocompromised and have chronic conditions such as irritable bowel or inflammatory bowel disease. Most of the patients enrolled in the PUNCH CD trials received vancomycin. So more data is needed to assess the efficacy of the fecal microbiota administration after they complete fidaxomicin. We don't have any data comparing the Rebiota enema with unlicensed compounded forms of fecal microbiota transplants because people have used manipulated whole stool in capsule form, and it's been given other ways. And then we also need more long-term safety data, and then use in patients with severe CDI. Next slide, please. So because this enema is manufactured from human fecal matter, it does carry the risk of transmitting infectious agents as well as food allergens, and the potential for adverse effects due to food allergens is unknown. As you would expect, after getting an enema, most of the side effects were GI in nature, so abdominal pain, diarrhea, abdominal distension, flatulence, and nausea. Next slide, please. So in terms of our PA criteria, right now we have PA criteria for fidaxomicin and bezlotoxumab, and our very intelligent P&T coordinators suggested that we develop PA criteria focused on preventing recurrent C. diff associated infection and retire the other two PA criteria. So in this new criteria that I'm proposing, the drugs that would be covered would be the bezlotoxumab for IV infusion, the fecal microbiota enema, and then any non-preferred drugs. There is another fecal microbiota preparation that was recently approved by the FDA. We'll be reviewing that later this year. It's an oral capsule that has to be given over 3 days. Next slide, please. So the PA criteria, basically, we would just ask if what's the diagnosis being treated and is it in an adult, because all of these medications to prevent recurrent CDI are only approved for use in adults. And then the first question would be, is it a request for bezlotoxumab? And so I use the IDSA SHEA guidance to say, is this a recurrent CDI infection within 6 months of the initial infection? Or if they're presenting with a primary episode, do they have other risk factors, such are they over 65 or immunocompromised, or do they have severe CDI? If that's the case, we want them to go to question 6 to make sure that they're currently receiving standard of care antibiotics. And if they are, then we would approve the bezlotoxumab for 1 dose. If it's not for bezlotoxumab, then they would go to question 7. And the first question we would assess, is this the second or more recurrence of a CDI infection? In the prescribing information for the fecal microbiota enema, it just says recurrent, it doesn't say how many. But based on the guidance from ACG as well as NICE, they pretty much had said if it's the second or more recurrence, that's when the fecal microbiota transplant is a good candidate to be administered. So then the last thing we want to double check is, have they completed, or will they have completed, a 10-day course of vancomycin or fidaxomicin prior to starting the vancomycin enema. It seems that most of these enemas are being administered by a provider. It is 150 mLs, and it has to have an administration set in order to administer. So either in the hospital or in the provider's office. So if they meet those criteria, then we would say approved for 1 course of therapy, which for the enema is just 1 dose. When we get the capsules added, that would be for 12 capsules. We'll be talking about that. So let's move on to the recommendations. So the recommendations are to maintain fidaxomicin as non-preferred, but retire our current fidaxomicin prior authorization criteria. That way we would just rely on the non-preferred PA, which basically just confirms that the requested drug is being requested for an FDA-approved indication. And then we would like to designate the fecal microbiota enema as a non-preferred drug on the PMPDP, subject to PA criteria, which would be the PA criteria I just went over. And we would include the bezlotoxumab as well as the enema in that new document. And then we would retire the current bezlotoxumab PA criteria, and then review comparative drug costs in exec session. Any questions for me about what I just went over?
Okay. I reviewed this topic because I'm on the P&T committee of an unnamed commercial insurer. And they actually had some good comparison data to what you call the compounded products. And the comparison that they had showed that the compounded products were substantially better than the FDA approved.
Interesting. Was that a network meta-analysis? Because I couldn't find any direct.
I do not have that on hand, and it would take me several days to dig it up, so I don't know where to go with that.
That's okay. Well, the compounded products have been used for quite a while.
Yeah,
In fact, in the packet, I included 2018 guidance from the British Gastroenterology Association, where they came up with MTs.
Before this was commercially available, there were a lot of GI centers who had their own donors and their own processing and so on and so on.
Exactly.
And that's where the idea came out that this might actually work. The second thing is on fidaxomicin versus vancomycin. The margin of benefit is pretty small and the confidence interval is pretty wide. And I don't know where you got the cost data, and we'll look at the confidential information, but looking at public information today, the GoodRx price for a course of oral vancomycin is $78. The GoodRx discount price for fidaxomicin is $4,500.
Wow. Wow.
So that's a difference. So you could treat 57 people with Vanco for treating one person with Fidaxo, and there's a tiny difference. So I'm not sure that unless our costs are a whole bunch better than that, I'm not sure that we should give open.
Well, we're not opening it. We're going to keep it as non-preferred, so it would still be subject to non-preferred PA criteria.
Okay, so does that mean they have to try vancomycin first?
No.
That's a flaw.
That's a flaw.
That's what you're advocating is you
Yes.
think we should
I think the evidence is not yet sufficient to spend a huge amount of money for a tiny potential benefit. And
So in the packet is the fidaxomicin PA criteria. So it sounds like what you're saying is we should not retire it and we should maintain it.
yeah, and unless there's something that we get a really good deal on that is confidential, I think the cost difference is so big that it's.
And I'm looking at the current PA criteria for fidaxomicin, and we do not require a trial and failure of vancomycin in the current PA criteria. It's,
I believe, sorry to correct that, Deanna, I believe we do. I think what is in the packet has probably been modified.
oh, gotcha. Okay, thank you,
so
Sarah.
apologies for that, but we do currently require a trial and failure
Thank you.
of at least one course of Vanco.
Okay. That makes sense because I would think we would have required vancomycin. I was just looking at what was in the packet. So, and your recommendation is that we require vancomycin based on cost, correct?
Yes. And marginal difference in effectiveness.
Okay.
I think there needs to be a route to get to it, because this is a horrible and difficult disease, and there will be some people who need it, but I don't think it should be first line.
Okay.
Deanna, quick follow-up question to that. So did I hear that right, though, that the most recent guidelines, though, do prefer fidaxomicin over Vanco as first line?
They do. And that's based, like Dr. Orger said, on some of the studies, which is moderate quality evidence, that systematic review that I put forward. But in the UK, the NICE guidance, they do not recommend, they still prefer vancomycin.
Okay.
And the IDSA SHEA guidance as well acknowledges that fidaxomicin might be cost prohibitive. I think when we go into exec session, we might be able to debate cost versus efficacy in more depth. I can't do that right now.
Yeah, no, I understand. And Bill's right. I mean, treating 57 people for the cost of one person, that does, that
Right.
makes a compelling argument for sure.
And that's based on good.
And just for clarification, in exec session, we can look at the cost, but we won't debate
Yes.
any questions about the criteria and the recommendation in front of you, or rejecting this recommendation will happen back out in open session.
Got it.
Thanks, Roger. Appreciate that additional clarification. But what it sounds like for now, you would like to strike the first statement and not retire the fidaxomicin PA criteria. What about the other? What about the other two recommendations?
I think they're reasonable. The data that I reviewed with the other company is interesting, but I can't put my fingers on it. And so and how would you approve the infinite number of potential products for this? No, I think that's good and we should leave it.
I did reach out to OHSU to ask how they're doing their fecal microbiota transplant and to see if they were planning on incorporating this product, and they couldn't give me an answer. I don't know if they haven't reviewed it at P&T yet, but I couldn't get any information from them in terms of what they're doing right now, because they do the fecal microbiota transplants. But
Have we allowed coverage of the compounded product?
It hasn't really come forward because I think it's been in hospitals when they've been doing it, because this is the first commercially available product. that we have.
So we wouldn't be paying for the compounded product.
Thanks, Roger.
Other questions? Great comments. Is there consensus among the committee to reject the first bullet, the first recommendation? Anybody opposed to rejecting that first recommendation? Okay, so then in front of the committee is the last 3 bullet points: to designate Rebiota as non-preferred, retire the current, yeah, that's why they don't have me read these. And review competitor cost.
And I'm not saying I'm pronouncing these correctly. I just do my best.
You do it with such authority that none of us would know whether it was right or wrong, so.
Well, I do try to look them up to make sure I'm pronouncing them correctly.
Move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Abstain? All right, thank you.
So the committee does need to go meet an executive session. I need to read a blurb. As I said, we'll be reviewing confidential pricing, but no decisions will be made. Information is on the screen. P&T committee will now meet an executive session for the purpose of the consideration of information or records that are exempt from disclosure by law. Executive sessions held pursuant to ORS 1926602F and ORS 414-3561 and 2, which allows the P&T committee to meet an executive session to discuss reviewing confidential drug pricing information, including substantial cost differences between drugs within the same therapeutic class. It's necessary for the committee to make final recommendations or to comply with the requirements of ORS 414-353. Representatives of the news media or designated staff should be allowed to attend the exec session. All other members of the audience are not permitted to attend the session. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to disclose any of the deliberations during the exec session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. At the end of the executive session, we will return to open session. We are returning from executive session. For those of you that were patient enough to wait around for us, we're going to make sure we get everybody out of the breakout room. I'm going to ask the committee to unmute your lines so I can do a head count. And so the recommendations after review in executive session, I'm going to lump together. So in the case of the CGRP inhibitors, the recommendations are no PDL changes are recommended. For the botulinum toxin class update, the review recommendation is no PDL changes are recommended. For the C. diff drugs class update, the recommendation is to make metronidazole capsules non-preferred. Any discussion? And if not, we need a motion to approve.
Move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Abstain? All right.
Well, fantastic. Appreciate your time and energy you put into this volunteer work. It's very important. The next P&T meeting is scheduled for August 3rd. About a week or so from now, we will be posting draft materials for some of our materials. So again, for the audience, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe on our listserv so you'll see those documents. That's the opportunity that we value when industry can, and any interested party can give us feedback on those draft documents for consideration. Those comments aren't shared with the committee, but they help inform the final documents that we'll post 30 days before that August 3rd meeting. So with that, we'll give you back 17 minutes. Thank you all.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Roger? Oh.